problem, since we're talking about tech, that maybe the audience can help me resolve with a thumbs up and thumbs down? I've just got a friend request on Facebook from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Should I accept or not? It turns out Hegel and I have 25 mutual friends. I don't know what to do. I mean, it might be a pseudonym, or it might be the spirit come from beyond, the specter, some Derridian specter of ontology. But anyway, I guess I'll work that out on my own. We're really excited. Well, this is a very important moment for me for another reason. I actually ran this theater in the 80s. I had a cinematheque here. I had just gotten back from living in Paris, and I thought that's what I want to do. I want to show 4 movies a week from all over the world, the stuff you couldn't even see in America, you know, Arab film festivals and things like that. Alexander Kluge, Kidlet Tahimik from the Philippines, lots of great stuff. And I had the most fun I've had in my life for a year and a half. And at the end of that, I lost $20,000. But I had fun because, of course, that was when they started to have VHSs, and all the people who were of the demographic that would go out to see these movies were all people who just suddenly started having kids, so they were staying home and watching video. But anyway, I still have a great deal of affection to this place, because every night I would go out to dinner somewhere or be at home. I'd call the projectionist midway through the movie and said, how many people do we get in the first show? I mean, if you talk about capitalism sort of owning formatting your time, just run a small business sometime, you'll find that you have always money enough. So no more digressions. On to this very, very exciting moment here. We're really honored to have Jason Adams of the New Center for Research and Practice, not only starting this event, I should say, but having moved to Seattle. I like to think that Red May had something to do with it, this kind of red future that we will all construct together in this red place. Wonderful. And if you don't know about the New Center, and I'm sure a lot of you do, just go online and look up New Center Research and Practice. It's a kind of worldwide network of researchers who are brought together to hear largely young and innovative faculty, or not, independent researchers from around the world who are get the opportunity to talk about or teach a seminar in something that the university where they work at won't let them teach, because it's too leading edge. Speculative realism, accelerationism, you name it, everybody's on top of it. Even some wonderful courses on the limits of capitalism by Nick, in fact, where I first met Nick online and became a Facebook friend. So Jason has assembled, under the aegis of the New Center and Red May, a galaxy of researchers who are in the New Center orbit and have come here. I'll let Jason introduce them, but Neha, Matthew, Alexandra, Nick, of course, and Petra. And here's Jason Adams.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We're going to have 2 different panels. We'll have a little break in between, and slightly different topics, but pretty much very related. And the first one will just be the people who are in this room, and the second one we're going to bring in people from New York City and from Berlin to be a hangout, who will also be part of the panel. So the panel is called Capitalism, Technology, Subjectivity, in Memoriam of Mark Fisher. If you know who Mark Fisher is, he recently passed away. He was a left commentator, kind of a para-academic. Occasionally had more established positions in academia as well, but for much of his life was kind of on the margins of academia, but still was very productive and prolific and influential. And so this panel is dedicated partially to his memory. And pretty much everybody on the panel, I would say, is familiar with Fisher's work, and for many of them was a major influence on their work. So the first panel is called "What Comes After the Subject: Technoculture and the Question," and this is partially influenced by a book called "What Comes After the Subject," or "Who Comes After the Subject," that was edited by believe Eduardo Cadarva and John Luc Nancy or something like that. And it had contributions from Giorgio Agamben and from a number of other thinkers at a time when there were debates going on about kind of how can we have a thought of collectivity without any overarching identity connecting that. So kind of community without identity was the idea. And in conceiving this panel, I mean, I can just read the description and kind of riff off of that. So basically, we're looking at the ways in which the technoculture of 21st century capitalism is transforming our understanding of subjectivity in imaginable and as yet unimaginable forms. Gender, the human, race, the cyborg, sexuality, artificial intelligence, indigeneity, the animal, and migrant subjectivities, amongst many others, are all directly impacted by the rise of new categories of life, as well as post-life modes of machinic being. So the idea here was we didn't really want it to be, explicitly just about, say, gender or just explicitly about race, but to really think that the question of subjectivity as a much larger whole, and how technology, new technologies are kind of changing our understanding of that, in various ways. And so the first panel is, sorry. So the first panel is kind of trying to think of more kind of a future-oriented question around that. So so kind of what comes after the subject is the idea of this one. And the second one is called Alt-Woke, Supremacismo Meltdown and Futurism of the Other. And that one is more kind of about the current situation that we're in kind of much more like temporally and spatially situated moment that we're in terms of the rise of the alt-right. And the Alt-Woke manifesto was a manifesto that was kind of responding both to the rise of the alt-right and to the rhetoric of wokeness and of woke, but trying to rethink that from a perspective that would be a little more critical and hopefully more effective. So I'll just start off with the first one. So what comes after the subject, technoculture and the question, and we can just I think the various people on the panel have kind of things that they were going to start with, and we can kind of make it just sort of a more kind of rhizomatic conversation that will start with the panel. But ideally, I'd like to see it be a situation in which people on the panel could ask people in the audience questions, people in the audience can ask the panel members can ask each other questions, and the same with the people in the audience. So so maybe we can just start down the line, and I can just start with Petra.
All right.
Is that okay?
Yes. Hello, I'm Petra. Starting. I'm probably not the one to start. Does anyone else feel like it? No? All right, Nick. You know what you're doing.
I don't really know. I mean, I'm not quite sure where to take the question, but I think it's an interesting sort of thing. I think I may just sort of riff on the stuff I've written on about synthetic freedom, which is sort of traditionally, well, the left recently has been all about equality and focusing on, getting rid of inequality, whether it be inequality in income or inequality in wealth or inequality in power. But the focus has been a lot on equality. And I think this sort of misses a certain aspect, a certain value that was traditional to, say, 19th century leftism, which was freedom. And it seems to me like the left has often given up the idea of freedom to the right. So you've got neoliberalism poses freedom as its absolute value. This is what it promises to citizens. This is what it promises to people. Get the government out of the way and you'll have freedom. Now, I think the left actually has a really important case to make about freedom. And what would a sort of future-oriented subject look like if it based around not the sort of negative freedom that neoliberalism poses. So the idea of taking away constraints. We're all free to go to sleep under a bridge. But actually thinking about a sort of positive sense of freedom or synthetic sense of freedom, which for me it's an attempt to invoke the idea that freedom is actually something which is constructed and it's artificial, it's not natural. So you don't just liberate constraints and then have freedom, instead you actually have to build it up. So for me, this is where a lot of my interest in technology comes from, is because technology is one of the key ways in which we build sort of artificial freedom. So that I think is, if we want to talk about a sort of future-oriented subject, I think getting away from equality and focusing more on freedom is going to be one way to start thinking about it.
So thinking off of that, hopefully I'm not giving away too much because I'm doing the other panel too. When thinking about and starting to try and make some notes for this whole thing, I started trying to analyze what was happening in politics right after Trump, because the whole reason why I'm here in the first place is because of that election. It was kind of a moment of realization that a lot of things that were really bizarre were happening. And what I thought was very interesting was the rise of things like that I think that are pure misinformation. Like, does anybody know about like the Pizzagate scandal or nobody?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And that's like kind of bizarre, right? Like we've always had conspiracy theories in our culture, but the extreme popularization of them to the point that I think the New York Times and Gawker, not Gawker, sorry, other places had to write about and address this conspiracy theory and say it's not real. So with that in mind, I started thinking about my own life and my own connection to media. And I really enjoy trash television, like reality TV. And I started thinking about concepts that Baudrillard had brought up in simulacra and simulation. So he presents the idea that simulation is a four-step process of destabilizing reality, and simulacra is just something that only references itself without any relation to or reference to the real. And what that means for me, and when looking at these digital spaces, is that I think we have, over time, definitely destabilized the real as, I don't know, whatever you want to say it was, as we know it, and we are definitely in a hyper-reality now, or a deep in hyper-reality. So he made a point to say with reality television that you connect with these stars and you feel this connection to them, and making a similarity between this connection in reality TV and the idea of Marx's idea of commodity fetishization, in which you don't, when you see the commodity, you don't see within it all the labor and things that are produced in it. So it's a moment of hiding something. So when you see reality television and you connect to it, what you fail to realize is that it's presenting to you a more real thing than your reality, or it's reflecting something about the reality that you're not seeing. So within the presentation of reality TV and this idea of surveilling people and acting as if you're a fly on the wall, it's moving along in accordance with the idea that we're moving into a more surveillance culture, as well as a more, I don't know, yeah, I'll just go with surveillance culture. So we can be surveilled almost at any time. We can also surveil others at any time. And this, I guess I'm positing, this hyper-reality becomes only deepened when you get to the internet, because any one of us can become both producers of content and can watch content at any time. And when you look at like memes and stuff, I think it's pure simulacra, because especially with like, anybody like remember like meme culture 1.0 is what I call it. Like if this meme culture is one of politics, the first one is one of just image, in which you got a lot of memes that were literally like somebody took a picture of someone like 10 years ago and it was on the internet, and then someone took it and put some words on it, and then that like people put different words on it and different words on it. And nobody asks where that image really came from. And no one really questions it. You engage with it as if it's just the image in of itself. And so I think it's like, oh yeah, like again, like pure simulacra. So sorry to ramble, but that are some of the things that I've been thinking about. What about you?
It seems that we could approach the idea of the disappearance subject from many angles. I think that when I think when a lot of people from this background would think about social construction, but there's also the element of the resistance against that by talking about biological programming, like the research that shows that if you get a heart transplant, that you start to take on the personality of the person's heart who you just received. Does anybody know about that? One person? Okay, so it's real. 2 people. I'm not making this up. And so we start to hear this and we start to think, okay, so the biological is the imperative. And it starts to move towards this essentialist direction. But the kind of like anecdote to that is, or anecdote would be that we can go in the opposite direction as well. That the CIA can do, and this is real too, and you guys are gonna disbelieve this as well, but the CIA has been doing research on tortured subjects that basically destroys this idea of biological imperative by seeing that the idea of the self is completely obliterated under certain amounts of stress, specifically keeping people up for 20 plus hours, 72 hours maybe, or maybe days on end, and then torturing them to desensitize them completely from their typical way of processing consciousness. And I'm not advocating for consciousness, I'm just using that word because it's easy. And so what we see is that this idea of like the disappearance of the soul in connection to the biological imperative, if we might call it the soul, or this self. I think the self is probably a more appropriate use of this. And so what does this mean in terms of politics? Well, it means that we have these 2 orders that are competing with each other, which is the past and the future, maybe the left and the right, the supremacists and maybe the activists. Yeah, so like these are the supremacists and the activists are like at the 2 ends of the spectrum. So we have the biological imperative, which is rooting for essentialism, phenotypic celebration of the European class. And then we have, the leftists who are pushing for social construction. And we now see that, in a roundabout way proved by some of these horrific cases of torture. So where do we go from here? Do we continue to, do we continue to fight on their terms? Or do we go towards, imagining, as Nick says, the synthetic, pushing for, a stronger synthetic order based off of this, culture war. And we now have the evidence to prove that we no longer have to fight on the terms of essentialism, and that we have the right and the ethical need to completely reject it. And does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that, actually? Do you have a question?
No, it makes sense.
Okay, cool. No questions? I want to make sure that this makes sense. And I also want to break the social order of like what we think we're doing, like we're the experts. Like I know everyone here at Red May knows what they're.
Are you talking about completely rejecting essentialism?
Well, thank you. What I'm doing is basically saying that like we need to move forward further into utopic kind of visions, imagining what we want, kind of like how neoliberalistic. Nick talks about that and then seeing the future. The Tea Party also did this too, in a sense where they unrelented in their visions of what political orders they wanted without basically settling with the Republican typical vision. Does that make sense?
No.
Oh, it doesn't. Okay. Follow up.
No, it's okay. I'll figure it out as we go along.
Oh no. Let's.
Even like, I mean, with the Tea Party is a really good. The Tea Party is a really good example. So there was obviously before the Tea Party existed, there was an existing Republican Party, and it was denoted by certain types of policies and a certain ideology that I guess you could say was a little bit more, I don't know, traditional, centrist almost, sort of, in comparison to what the Tea Party wants. And just by formulating this vision and, like Matt just said, like unrelenting and not being willing to compromise on this vision of the future, if you notice now, like most of that party has been usurped or taken over by the Sarah Palins or the Ted Cruzes, and you don't see as much of the would be like a older Ron Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Oh,
Ron. Well,
No, he's still retired.
like a Paul Ryan or a
Dole?
Bob Dole is a good
Bob
example.
Dole.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
yeah.
Yeah, I think what you say makes sense, Matthew. I mean, and I think also, there are probably many different ways and languages to reformulate that in. But, you're linking the tradition, I think, where Nick talks about constructing something synthetic.
Exactly.
The notion that
Synthetic orders.
the order that the right pretends is a natural order is, in fact, if we look at Nick's book and others, from Pellerin and others, a constructed order that was put together through many years of debates and ended up becoming the new common sense. And so part of what we are trying to do on the left, in all of our various ways, is to construct a different sort of common sense. And I think what the Nick's book really emphasizes is that involves not only constructing a new present, but the future, which has been abandoned to a certain sense by a kind of right-wing vision of, in fact, a future that's nothing but a repetitive kind of eat, work, sleep, and so forth, and accumulative.
And I only bring this up because I feel like the subject is the key to the political, in the sense that we have to start from this, like we can talk about the political order, but we also have to talk about the subjective order and how that relates to the political. And unless we can connect the two, we can't start to create any synthetic order, I would say. That makes sense. Yeah.
I didn't just give my comment.
Oh, yeah.
So I've always, it's kind of hard to take this question apart. Sometimes when I spend time with leftists, what I'm hearing is the supposition that you're going to create order, or you're going to you're going to conceptualize a vision, and the term common sense is really important here. And what is the common sense? I think in many ways, common sense, if we were to be emotionally, truthfully honest, would be one of trauma. And you have a pretty long history of deeply traumatized peoples attempting to circumvent a natural process, a natural processing, which I think we risk in terms of, like, when we vilify essentialism, we have a word we don't like, and maybe essentialism kind of points to a practice that does become supremacist oriented. However, in terms of biological imperatives, the human animal is a very sensitive thing, And that we're living in a time, it's 2017, we're living in a time where, and this is to me, it's the early stage information age. And we haven't actually learned how to process information. Whether it's the Tea Party, whether it's, the Trump movement, you're exposing people to information that they actually don't have it's not that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the practices as a culture to parse them. What's true and what isn't true. And I think, something that I notice about political dialogue today is you have people who show up they're patriots, or hardcore leftists, and we have this idea of freedom. But the more that you look at it, these are image obsessions. And I tend to think that, where you locate freedom is really based off of stratifications. It's based off of how you stratify it. Nick, casually mentioned going to live under a bridge. And that presupposes that I'm the kind of person who would need someone to build a bridge for me to live under, right? And yet there are some qualities around physiology, neurophysiology that we just don't know enough about yet. People talk about identity and you say, well, I feel a certain way. And what we're not talking about is neuroception. Stephen Porges, who's the author of the polyvagal theory, really digs into neuroception, the idea that the body is kind of registering safety and non-safety in these very immediate ways that affect heart rate, that affect the entire system that the heart is based around. So it's not surprising that you would replace someone's physiology. You would have a heart transplant and suddenly have these experiences, emotions, because the vagus nerve is that powerful. And what we're doing is we're actually kind of abusing the vagus nerve. We're abusing the 10th cranial nerve. We are essentially, in terms of information processing, it's like we're staring into a light bulb all the time. And then you have people who take on concept and take on ideology, and they take on these constructs that aren't actually real. When it comes down to it, you're a patriot. Perhaps you've never actually gone to war. Have you ever worked at a federal building? You're a leftist. Do you want to create order or synthesize something? When's the last time you've gone to work for the Department of Energy? You're an environmentalist. You've never gone to work for Geological Survey. Do you know how seismic networks are even, built or constructed? Do we know anything about what it means to participate such that we can actually dial into what the practices are? Most of what I've heard in politics, I think since the 80s, has been about this idea, like these utopic visions that are mostly constructed behind closed doors, not through constant practice and participation in what we would consider to be the real world. We see something on television, we see something on the internet, we say, fuck that, that's not cool at all. But when's the next time you're actually going to go attempt to work for these people? When are you going to go work for the government? If you knew you could change the future by going to work for the government today, who would be signing up? Who could go teach classes at the Air Force? Who would go teach classes in these mostly enclave enclosed environments? And in terms of the culture, we have kind of an interesting divide. You have a part of this culture that's used to conceptualizing, and then you have a part of the culture that's used to putting its body on the line. You have bodies. People put their bodies on the line, whether they're willing to or not. These aren't choices that are made. It's a result of oppressions. But ultimately, those who survive oppressions tend to be the people who are most equipped to take on real practice. So I do think that while synthesis is the main, we're kind of missing. I think that in terms of our technoculture and technological tooling, there's going to be a time where perhaps we will have dialed in certain aspects of the human physiology such that we can say more about what the sense is. Why do you feel unsafe in a room full of men? Why is it that we're even talking about freedom? If I took two strangers out of this room and put them in a closet together, it'd be quite uncomfortable, right? So what's happening there? And this is really kind of an interesting feature of the xenophobia that comes out of supremacy. It's an interesting feature of how we're sort of created, is that I always say I've traveled quite a bit, and when I come back to the States, I realize something. Americans are scared of each other. we're scared of each other in a way that we tend not to find in other places. Maybe that's because there's a uniformity to people, uniformity to the culture, there's formalities. We're not necessarily the most long-lived culture, and yet we're the first ones to be kind of playing with tools. I'll have jokes with my friends. I'll say, "Oh, Americans invented the personal computer. We did that. It's Americans. We did that." But what for? For business. And here we all are in business machines trying to have really deep, cogent, coherent conversations, and then we wonder why it doesn't work. So I would say that, at least in terms of like Mark's comments around the post-capitalism in which you kind of departed from a reliance on capitalist contouring, we're going to have to look at how we've poorly implemented the latest and greatest, that these aren't actually really the real things. These are intermediaries, and in some cases mistakes we haven't even recognized yet. There's like a convergence of the real with the information space, the cyberspace, the real space and the cyberspace, and we still haven't been able to define the difference between what's just information and what's experiential. What did you actually do versus what you actually read? You have a problem with the government, and who's going to go work for the Treasury Department, so you can actually be around these people and just get a sense. What's the common sense among that crowd? So that's kind of where I would start the conversation.
Okay, do you want to comment on that?
I'm interested in this idea of like platform pathologies, but I think I need a reality check because I might be someone who's particularly vulnerable to something like Facebook, which I've noticed in the way that I use it. If I go back and look at my own activity, the things I've posted, or the pictures I've posted, it's really this kind of like abyssal horror, and it's because I almost feel like in the course of the way that Facebook collects data, which is what's saleable, it's what you offer advertisers who will take that and target advertisements towards you. So in one sense, like there is a weird ergonomics to Facebook. Like when you're going to design a toothbrush, you don't design it for any particular hand. You design it for hands in general. And so in a way, it is this, like to take on a certain kind of tool is also to bring it into some small sense, at least, your self-concept. And so Facebook as a tool, I think, has this way of, in my experience, occluding my own self-concept from me. So when I look at my own, like, posts from the past and stuff, I get this horror where I'm like, oh, I cannot possibly correspond with this person, right? Like this, I hope this isn't me. I really would like to believe I'm not what I've represented, but in a way, I don't have a choice. There's this regime change where Nick made a really interesting point that like data is to large technology companies what oil was in the 20th century in a lot of ways, in the oil age. And so in the process of being a oil reservoir, so to speak, as a user of Facebook, I'm alienated from my self-concept in a way, and horrified by the doubled version of whatever it was I thought I am, being, like I said, occluded, being literally owned and saleable and I don't know if it's all that. I want to call it the platform pathology, but I'm also willing to just own the pathology. That it's just maybe me. But I dropped it. Oh, it's like, for instance, like if you look at your advertising preferences, I get ads for fatherhood and wedding dresses. So what does Facebook think I am? You know, I don't think it can see me, and in a way, a lot of the people I know in this room have only ever seen me in that context, and they don't see the ads I see, obviously, but I have a hard time maybe coping with this like out of body near death social media experience, like the horror of, like, you know, leaving your body and seeing yourself and being kind of like your subjectivity is in a sense reappropriated. My subjectivity is in a sense reappropriated. I wonder if anyone else gets that feeling. Am I just like totally neurotic? Yeah, yeah. All right. So it's then I would think it is maybe like a pathology of the platform itself in the case of Facebook. And so I would maybe ask the other members of the panel, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that this well? Go ahead.
Do you want to go, Matthew, or I can go ahead? Okay, well, I guess the way that I see the internet and Facebook and stuff, maybe it's just because I've always consumed probably more media than one should, or most, is a really, like, almost an objective way. Like when things happen on Facebook and when they started getting ads, I think more correctly to what my interests truly was or are, I was like, oh, interesting, the algorithm's better. Like it's more accurate. I think because sometimes, and it just depends on the person, but I think that there is something inherently democratic in a sense about the internet, but it's also happening alongside commodification of your interests. But that has always been the case in capitalism. When you get television and you watch, like, I don't know, people used to like Walter Cronkite or something like that, it's interspersed with ads that are telling you to buy Frigidaire things. So it's obviously telling you an identity alongside giving you information. With that said, when I look at the internet, I try to keep in mind for myself that it is an information economy, and things tend not to become popular, I think, on the internet that people do not will into existence through clicking. Just like when you look at TV history and media, you see certain shows start to pop up that runs concurrent with the creation of new economic groups. So you get more differences in Black culture in television, like not just the Cosby Show, but maybe to some degree Family Matters, or things that explore the Black middle class, as opposed to things like Good Times or something, which are hunky-dory stories about oppression, because you get a rising middle class, because you can't have this media, I don't think, without, like, people aren't going to put this media on television if there isn't a market for it. So obviously, I guess there's a relation. So the way I see media and information in technology is that it is a thermometer through which you can see what's going on in the culture at the time. So with the internet, I guess I feel a little bit less alienated from it. I just kind of see it in this certain way, mainly because I think with things like clickbait and becoming popular, and like the fall or the destruction for a little bit of long form true journalism and the rise of it again recently, is because people, it's saying something about what people wanted at that time or what they were willing to invest in. Like, clickbait obviously is made to be alluring, but I think again that's with everything. Like the image to us is just essentially alluring, and we get an ecstasy out of watching images. But if people didn't fall for that, or they didn't want to get that gratification in that specific way from clickbait itself, we wouldn't have BuzzFeed at all. And like there's two sides of BuzzFeed. Obviously, there's BuzzFeed like culture and BuzzFeed News now, but they literally became popular by gaining, whatever you want to call it, gaining that system. So.
I love what Hutcher brings up with these algorithms that are predicting who we are. I like the way they come up in social situations when you're searching your Facebook with your friends, and an ad for premenstrual cramps comes up, and your friends are like, "Are you researching that?" Basically, they're thinking that, right? And you're wondering why they're judging you. It's kind of like a 3-year-old that just like says the truth, right? And you're like, wait, I did not tell a 3-year-old that. It's kind of like that, right? But we also know that those algorithms need some calibration, and it's not entirely true. And that the 3-year-old needs calibration as well. But just because they're rude, right? That's all I was gonna say.
Technically, the 30 or the 40 or the 50-something-year-old would also need calibration. Just based on how the world looks these days, Yeah, I started, I may not be the only person in the room to remember the internet before the web. My first experiences being on anything even network-centric started at MIT. I was their first summer program, and I was on the Athena clusters there. And we had Usenet, and Usenet was this really sort of interesting. There was a popular culture called the Well from that time, and there was also just this free form text-based textual mode of communication, and the big thing about Usenet, and this would probably be about 92, 93, it existed way before I came along, but when I had started using it, I was probably 14. And the thing about Usenet is you had to be hyper literate. You had to be so literate on Usenet because you're actually talking to real scientists, real people, real psychologists, real people who are out there doing stuff. And God forbid you said the wrong thing or presupposed the wrong knowledge. There was someone who was going to school you on how to actually forge a real life katana. Someone's going to tell you how to actually build a highway because they had done it. Civil engineers would just show up out of nowhere, and nitpick and get into all these things that sort of extract the user, the participant, out of the domain of self-knowledge and the way that you kind of conceived of your own knowledge into this really strange, bizarre world of people who you didn't see, who have more information than you, perhaps were trying to educate you, and if you resisted that, then there was at least like a good 2 weeks of flame wars and all of these ad hominems and epithets you'd never heard of. You didn't know people could say that on the internet every time. It's just, you're just totally flame wars, And I think going through that period into BBSs, and by the time, say, AOL came along, all that was garbage. And Facebook, having kind of assumed the mantle of the walled garden of the social network, also felt like a big tire fire. It's like, oh, okay, so you've got all these people, except there's not as much literacy as there used to be. And how we're sort of relating to ourselves and how people are relating to the information and the things about ourselves that we're putting out there. From my standpoint, really, there's no real way. I mean, I can appreciate that the persona is a thing, and I can appreciate that that public attention is in some way what we all want as attention-seeking. Humans, there's some attention you want from people, but it does occur to me, and I've said this probably too many times, which is that, out of people who you can post a simple thing and get, 70 likes, 100 likes, go to the hospital the next day, and you will not have 70 or 100 people show up to see you. You might have 4 or 5 people show up to see you. I think that the way that people are identifying with Facebook is something of, it's a fallacy of the information age, of dark era information age, which is that it's not that we can't tell the difference, it's actually just that we're really addicted to something that gives us this immediate feedback. And so can't tell, or in some sense, psychologically, physically, can't always tell the difference in the moment between when someone's shaking your hand and saying, that was an amazing post, I read it 3 times, and I went and talked to, my partner about it, and we went and talked to our friends about it, and we just think it's really great, and we like it, versus when people are just liking something that you've posted on Facebook. And how is it that rational people can mistake those two things, really? I mean, that's the question about it. I mean, if we just took everyone in this room and we threw you out into the jungle or the desert somewhere, the reality is that you need something considerably more material to identify with the self. And in fact, you're identifying with the self every day in a much more material sense. It's just that's all kind of capital. And information, people make attempts to create capital out of information. And it's really, it's pliable in a sense. You have ads, but they get them wrong, and they're kind of weird. Like I don't know when I'll be married next. I was married once, but otherwise it's like, why am I seeing this ad? People say things like Facebook thinks, and it reminds me of a time early on. My sister was having a computer problem, and she said, "It's mad at me. I did a thing and it's really mad at me." And it's kind of like, this thing is just broken shit. That's the only reason why you're even tripping over this, because you got to sit here with this bullshit piece of software that doesn't really do everything it says that it does. Facebook is very much the same way. And the thinking that happens at Facebook happens during scrums, sprints, meetings, and people there get it wrong, and PRs and code commits and a lot of other sort of intricacies of developing software. Facebook itself creates the appearance of thinking, which is kind of, we have this wave of artificial intelligence and this contact with artificial intelligence, where it's like Turing. I don't have strong opinions on just the existence of that thing itself, but I do feel like the minute that you think Facebook is thinking about you, it's kind of like believing that Sylvester Stallone was really a war vet hiding out in a cave somewhere. And it's a suspension of disbelief, and you can disbelieve it pretty much at any time. And yet, when you kind of fold into concept, if you give up your grasp of self-concept, in the case of young people, will be on Facebook and be taking things very seriously. It's all very serious. And even people who aren't young, I mean, people who perhaps haven't developed a certain mode of processing, I just consider myself to be somewhat desensitized, but also, I know I can see the person behind the curtain a lot of the time as well. And I think that we're creating a generation of young people who are actually learning how to code, and it won't be long before you actually have a whole population of people who can write 8 or 9 different Facebook clones, types of social networks, and we won't really be able to get away from the wall, the social network, or even the federated social network in some sense. But there will be more of an attempt to look under the hood. I think people will become a lot more conscientious of what's going on behind the veneer, and an acknowledgement that you're really just looking at style sheets and little boxes and images. I don't know how many times I've met someone from over the internet, and you see all these pictures, and you see them in person, and you're like, oh, okay, I would have thought you were totally different from the images I saw. I think we'll be a lot more culturally aware of that as time goes on. But for now, I believe this is a very addictive quality of our media, which is, the more informed you believe you're becoming about someone, or the more informed you think your interface is becoming about you, then you'll sort of base a whole set of behaviors and reactions around that. And it won't, no one really stops to shake you out of it. No one shows up and says, oh, this is a big joke. It's not even really Facebook. Ha, 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 ha. There's not really the possibility for that. So the same way that, older generations would listen to the radio and believe that there really was an alien invasion, right? So, I believe that there will be a time in the future where people will look back on this time with some amount of depression and sadness, like, wow, all those people were basically going through this really intense psychological experiment, and willingly expose themselves to that, willingly expose their children to that, willingly expose their friends to it. Before we really had a lot of a real concrete theory around digital social interactions and, which is not to say I haven't really found myself on Facebook kind of bummed out. Nobody liked my post. What's the problem? You guys don't like me anymore. I can show the party. I'm a sound artist, among other things, and they placing their art into the public space in the internet age, and information age, is something that is, there's a real dissatisfaction there in some sense. And that what you want to be doing is creating space for your art to be experienced, and that's not happening. What you're doing is you're making it really easy for people to access something that's ultimately disposable, and in a few minutes they'll be on to something else. And this is the same problem that advertisers have as well. That your impression of their product is really like kind of a snap thing, and may not last. May not turn into something you buy.
So I was just like I was fascinated with listening to your memories of being on the well and the early thing, and what I was thinking as I listened to it is that there was no question of checking a like or dislike before a certain era. At the time of the well, I formed part of a network of detached voices in cyberspace called Invisible Seattle here, which was focused on literary collaboration, a sort of collective think online, where people would post under various pseudonyms, just for the pleasure, or heteronyms, like some poets write under other names. And I do have a certain nostalgia about that I want to try to discipline. And just only keep it in mind that there was no direct line from what was happening then to what is happening now. There had to be an intervention, a moment, when capital looked at this space that was not occupied by anything and thought, ooh, we can make a lot of money out of this by doing it. And that's the reason it evolved in the way that it evolved. It could have gone in a lot of other directions. It probably can't go in many of those directions now, as I think Nick's book established, just because of network effects, because the fact that it's been occupied to such a degree that even trying to build out to one of those directions that it could have been, it's very difficult to get people off of things that they're hooked on. But it is, I think, important to just keep thinking about what it was and what it could have been, because we never know of the system. The fact that, as Bratton would say, they always exceed the capacity of designers to know what could be done with them by Neha or others, or Petra come in, who have a different way of how you could build accidents in this, the way push it more in a direction that's away from what capital wants. I mean, those possibilities are already there, but it really is, it's an absolute divide. To the point where, I don't know, Tim Berners-Lee, the famous statement, this isn't what I imagined.
Right. Yeah.
He said it.
Dr. Frankenstein.
So the way I see it, you guys have you see the subject as being very passive, and you're sort of like talking about this really bizarre form of communism, where people are only communal through clicking. Okay, and so what I was wondering is, with Marx, the ontological essence of humans with Marx is their productive capacity, their ability to create. And he saw the subject, that is an essential quality of all human beings, and he saw the subject as active. So do you guys see the subject as active in any way other than being like bombarded by media?
Yeah, totally. I mean, but I think that I think the subject is, sorry, I got excited. I think the subject is definitely has the ability to be active and is active online. It's just that it's not fully aware of the ways in which it can be active online. At least the left isn't.
Do you
I
see
think-
online activism or the active zone, or do you see
Yeah.
the subject active other than being online?
I think that there's not much a differentiation anymore. I think that space has become so digitized that I consider online space to be as the same kind of as walking on the street.
Oh.
And I think that if you look at the right and the way that they have coalesced in the alt-right, they definitely understand the way that you can construct the active subject and change the space online.
I'd like to actually ask a question that making the point you made that online space and walking on the street are not that different in a different direction, which is the way in which there might be a false nostalgia for the understanding we had, that if we are now confused about what do we understand here, we might be projecting back some sense of understanding that didn't actually exist. And I was struck by the way you said, if you look that people will look under the hood, and people say Facebook did this. But at the same time, in this room, we use the word that capitalism did this, economy did this. Day after tomorrow, capitalism will take a walk on the beach. The day after that, it will, so capitalism is as reified by us. And it's odd the way we talk about it, because I actually, if you look at what happens in policy circles, for example, or if you you go to these meetings, yes, you go to the World Bank meetings, and you go, and it's not like a monolith. It isn't, right? And there is an actual anthropological and sociological questions, things that they get wrong. There's ways in which you get seduced, I think often, and this is the question I want to ask. It is not the first, there was a period when feminists, for example, were really seduced by the idea that the World Bank was interested in breaking from the IMF, which it did, and in making millennial development goals. People still talk of neoliberalism as the IMF and the World Bank are the same, but basically millennial development goals have been part of what the World Bank has been doing for almost 18 years now, right? And it's what it's doing as an architecture of policies substantially different in many ways. A lot of the neoliberal policies, so to speak, are not even proposed by the IMF anymore. When you got the IMF getting very freaked out that countries reducing its money supply too rapidly, and the government is like, no, we have to control inflation. That tells you that something else is going on, right? And so I'm wondering if maybe part of the question of the subject being constructed might, to go back to the question of visions of communism, might really be interesting to hear more about what, I would be interested to hear more about what this built subject who promotes freedom might look like, because in some ways it is the same question we had earlier. What might this built world in which we have development, what might this built world in which we're independent, what might this built world in which, we have, so I come from a country which has actually elected communist parties, what does that look like? And it would be interesting for me to hear that in these visions of subjectivity.
I just wanted to comment on the active subject. I think it does exist well outside of online culture and digital media. I think that in today's world, the burden on the active subject is just how active. we have examples of movements that have created program, have engaged in a non-digital world. We have a really strong history of that and some very strong practices around them. However, they still sort of suffer from an outsider culture approach. And I think just speaking to this subject, I think that we're probably going to have to question just how outside we really can be in order to dispossess or displace power in the world. And in that sense, maybe I'm thinking more Gramscian, the war of maneuver versus the war of position, and the place and the role of organic intellectuals in the culture. Maybe less so being in a classroom, but more so being the people who go work for a telephone company, or who go find a way to the IMF, and perhaps, not as the revolutionary imagery gets in the way in some sense, where one's participation becomes dependent on perpetuating an image of resistance. Whereas I actually think that we have the capacity or capability to be active, and for the subject to be fully active, and as someone who plays a role, and even in some cases pretends that a role in capitalist society. You can navigate extensively with just a resume alone. It doesn't even have to be a good one. It doesn't even have to be true. Which I find to be interesting about the capitalist world, is if they can call enough people to verify who you are, and we've ultimately exploited trust of some of the most powerful corporations and entities on the planet. I mean, anyone here could go work for Chevron today, technically. What you do when you get there is really about how much preparation you've taken up until that point, but that's just some thoughts on that. We have a question.
I was just going to add to it. I was talking about, and basically that this idea of being on the outside is like relatively easy. I mean, when we start to zoom back and start to think about the developed versus the underdeveloped world, or the developing world, or the global south, we start to see that there's different time spaces working in terms of how technology is affecting them. Even if you go to certain parts of Ohio, you have technology blackouts in Amish country, and the way that the subjects are, being created in a traditional sense in these areas are completely different than maybe some areas in Silicon Valley, even in the imaginations of certain people. And that going back to your question and kind of like me ripping, I'm not sure if your name, but your question as well. We do have aspects of like the real that we have to deal with. We have Facebook wanting to connect the whole world, but that there's still an element of social integration that is not happening because of the technology inequalities that exist. And that when we're trying to construct the self, that we will have to kind of reconcile the inability to put everyone in the same time period. Because it's 1800 in some places in the world, it's 1700. It's the year zero. So when we're talking about this, I think that's one of the fundamental issues, is that we can't get on the same page for that issue. And if we're going to talk again about the biological imperative, that, when I was saying that there isn't, that we have to focus on the non-essential self, I wasn't talking about jogging, the effects of jogging, because food is obviously good for you. You should try to regulate the body. There is real biological things, but that there's inequalities of how each body is experiencing these things, and that, basically certain identities are expressing, or are taking on stress at different levels. And this is the basis of how these networks are constructed. So we have certain networks of people that have access to jobs and to services, And I'm not talking about networks in the sense of platforms, I'm talking about real life networks. And we have certain people that are taking on the effects of network oppression that don't have access to getting a job because there is this natural order that we have to resist and think beyond. That when you're a trans person, I once identified as a woman, and one of the difficulties of identifying as a woman and dressing as a woman as a person who is born as a man is that when you try to get a job, that you can get fired if you don't use the name that you were given at birth, or you most likely you won't get a job if you don't come dressed as the name on your driver's license. And that's the form of network oppression. So in a way, we have to form a way of thinking past these things by identifying that those natural orders are inhibiting, or they're actually, sorry, not inhibiting, they're complicit in this natural order that we have to basically decentralize and break down and move past.
Kind of moving on from there, but also like talking about information and misinformation. Trying to like create an artificial or synthetic subject, specifically when it comes to like marginalized communities and so on. Like when you guys were talking about talking about how most online information is misinformation, but there's this complete seriousness in engaging with it. So like when using like how misinformation is something that's used specifically in political movements, specifically like in mostly like in like the alt-right and so on. Like, the question is mostly like when trying to avoid the natural order, isn't then misinformation or like fake information, or like then in a more positive way, not as negative, but as more of a positive act, as the positive act of like creating the real and so on, which is like instead of using your dead name or like a legal name, personally for yourself, or like using like a preferred name and so on, and but using that, but doing that in a more larger scale, like up the left, and the possibilities of misinformation on the left, and revisionism, and seeing those things not as negative to be avoided, but as as a positive political effect, and can achieve like a synthetic subject should something that's considered usually negatively as misinformation or revisionism or propaganda.
I do know that there's an app actually that sends out misinformation about yourself. So in like your off time, it'll just visit all these random websites, basically to disrupt your online profile, which sounds amazing to me.
Wow.
But I was going to say, I forgot what it's called, or otherwise I don't shall know, but it's out there. I was like maybe pick on something Petra was talking about, the advertising, as a sort of reflection of your own subjectivity. And I think we probably all had the experience where like actually we've seen advertising develop in quite sophisticated ways. Where advertising beforehand was like, why the hell do I want this? Whereas now I'm getting advertisements for t-shirts with like, don't you hate Mondays? I'm like, oh, I kind of do want that. So it's getting better and better and better. But I think the real sort of next step will actually be advertising where it reflects something back to you where you're like, oh, I didn't know that about myself actually. It almost becomes a sort of psychoanalytic moment of like just reflecting back something you didn't realize about yourself. I think that's sort of quite interesting way to think about this, the data production as well.
Yeah.
I actually made a short film about this recently, about how data is starting to become so personalized that they're able to track your desire, basically like the capitalist desire, and that basically eventually what's going to happen is that it's going to predict, and I think Nick is maybe alluding to this, maybe, but going back to even Nick's idea is this capitalist appropriation of inventing the future, where they're actually able to create an order based on your desire you didn't yet realize, because the predictive software is becoming better and better. And I've started taking classes in predictive statistics, and people are now talking about this as a positive thing.
I think there's an important caveat there. With current AI techniques, they're still all based on statistical network models, where you're just trying to predict what something like what a conscious mind would do in that situation. So they're always statistical. I've talked with a researcher. I think she works at Google. I talked with her like a month ago in San Francisco, and she had just discovered like the prime order logic, which underlies meaningful semantic computation. And she was like about to present it. I probably shouldn't have said that, but yeah. So there's like, and I've been working on similar research. So there's like glyphic encodings of meaning, and the property that's key here about these types of systems is that ethics seems to be inherently built into them. So yeah, so you would have to invent a whole new form of yoking this form of intelligence, this computational intelligence, to unethical procedures, and it would always be escaping that somehow as well. So I think that it will evade capture.
Yeah, the research I'm talking about is actually that they now believe basically that they can predict when you'll die based on your heart rate variability. Also research with a scientist who's working with a Russian Olympic team who believes that he can predict panic attack based on your heart rate variability and a certain qualification of accuracy, but something that we're not talking about in like semi-serious terms, which seems kind of sci-fi.
But they don't know why you're having a panic attack or why you're dying.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that brings in like a kind of scary thing where like, what if an insurance company starts to be like, oh, well, you need to figure out your heart rate variability so you know how often you have panic attacks and you're gonna die, and then we can base our costs for pre-existing conditions and go into pre-existing condition and a more ugly technological control aspect.
Gotta find your best friend, record their heartbeat.
Yeah.
So I have one last question for you guys. I won't ask you anymore. I want you to talk about human emancipation.
Sure.
Where do you see all this leading to human emancipation?
The other.
The big other.
The other.
Not the big other, the other.
The other. Like the
Human
other,
emancipation, like liberation, like
The other.
how,
like
how do
other.
you see this ending? Where do you see it going so that human beings can liberate themselves from capitalism or liberate themselves from whatever they perceive as being their oppressor?
The intrinsic capability because of the natural oppression and order that we discussed earlier, and especially Matt was discussing. And this is more for the second part of this panel, I guess, or the second panel that we have. We're going to discuss who is the subject more. I believe that even though these subjects have been oppressed, they also have the intrinsic liberatory capabilities to transcend that oppression. And I believe that if there is to be a subject for this future, it's going to be the other plus technology. Because, like we were all talking about it last night, or some of us, that when you think about what is Blackness, it is complete otherness, it is complete alien. It is like the sense of having a home and building something off of, I guess we were talking earlier about simulation, it's building it off of just references. It's nothing there, and then the references keep building. Like if you look at the history of hip hop, it is a genre created out of oppression, and it has a both self-referential aspect to it and a pastiche element to it. So it always transforms. And when you look at like the trans community or something, they are used to taking on, playing with identity in such a way that I think is intrinsically liberatory. So I think that the subject can only be the other.
Isn't there an aspect of material conditions as well? Like the fact that scarcity is an illusion and is a game, and oppression is really to maintain that illusion.
Right.
And so one method of liberation would be to break that illusion apart and demonstrate distributed abundance.
I think one way I like to think about it is like pre-capitalist era, we had you had to work because of material necessity. Under capitalism, we have to work because of social necessity. And post-capitalism would be just we work because we want to. I think that this is sort of to answer like your question of what emancipation is. For me, at least, it's free time. Free time is a fundamental condition of emancipation.
Well, it was how did we get there? How did you see us getting there?
Or revolution, but
Well, first we have to question what it is.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that the way the culture identifies with time has long been problematic. I think re-identification or a change or shift in culture Alex's otherness, and I've actually gotten to a place where I'm considering this sort of a new body consciousness, which sometimes can be unfortunate. Sometimes you say that and everyone starts thinking yoga class. That's not what I'm talking about. It's really just kind of a recognition of a phenotype. And I believe that there is technical innovation along those lines. I think that someday we'll find not only a greater capacity to, or at least there will be a precursor to greater capacity to communicate and express one's state, but also greater capacity to change one's state and to become aware of biases and judgment preference. Because in a lot of ways I do see a barrier to emancipation being, the human itself. That you really only need to convince a person of maybe a few key things before they've taken that for granted and continue and perpetuate a pattern set of behaviors. Then there's also the question of how the left begins to design epiphanies, because I think when we talk about revolution, we have kind of an external sensibility around what that means and the implications. The how sometimes devolves to like a physical confrontation. You're supposed to charge in somewhere with guns and shoot everybody, or there's the bloody revolution. Whereas I actually believe that we will become better at igniting epiphanies in people, especially those who are on oppositional sides. I think that we have to. There's actually a kind of requirement, and it really doesn't come down to quoting writers and authors. It actually comes down to constructing experiences for people. In some cases that they're not quite ready for. Something I noticed about the Trump campaign, I had a group of friends and they're all very, very politically minded, and they were really angry. Quite a few of them were white males, and we hung out and I'd say things like, well, if we just cut your hair, right, and shave your face and we put you in a button up and we give you a clipboard, I mean, you could go walk through the Trump campaign headquarters right now. Okay, you can do it right this second. And is that a tactical advantage that we're talking about? Well, yes, that means that we're trying to infiltrate something. We just sent some people into the midst, and we'll just see what we pick up. Because I come from an information security background, I have a lot of baggage attached to that. Why don't you just drop a bunch of USB keys with malware infected on them around, and we'll really get this started like the right way, But it was really funny because for all the people, and a couple were journalists, and in the end, none of them wanted to do it. And I go, you guys, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't walk through. If I could, I would be there already. I would have been there already. And I've been in some really interesting situations, at least in the corporate world, in the federal world. People just don't see me coming. Whatever they see on a resume or whatever they have to name it, not aware of what they're going to get when I actually show up to do the job. And frankly, as a trans woman, you kind of get a kick out of the idea that you can show up at like this, large scale corporate retailer, and it's all you and good to see you, great work, thanks. Okay, and this is a company like McDonald's. I mean, it's like these people are experientially as a heading and as an idea, a corporation is kind of an evil place. But once you get inside, you start interacting with people, suddenly all these eyeballs and all these gears start turning, all these epiphanies begin to happen. So how do you do that from far away? How do you create, reconstruct, and reimagine the epiphany for this new age? In the same way that workers who were starving might go, you know what? I think we just need to kill that motherfucker today now. I mean that is its own epiphany. But I believe that we can't. We devolve when we regress to physical violence, and we think that that's going to solve anything. The question is, how do you begin to change people's minds at any stage in life, at any life stage? And I think that's really a big part of this whole idea around emancipation, because there are a lot of people, if you tell them what emancipation looks like, more free time, they don't believe you. They do not believe in free time. They don't even really know or conceptualize time in such a way that they would really even know what to do with that free time. What would I do? And there's a lot about this culture and society where we don't create spaces where some people with creative tools that really make those things matter or count. So so a lot of capitalist culture, time doesn't matter, and there's got to be a way you make that.
Someone there was first, but this is maybe more.
Somebody else.
Okay. Well, that what you just said.
I mean, I like want to respond to both of the more recent comments, like specifically the idea of like, I mean, I know it's obviously like a simple kind of statement, but like that freedom is, or like liberation is free time, and also the, like, again, vague, and I know we're gonna have, there's a, a whole thing about it, but like this idea of like the other plus technology as a kind of like way to liberation. It seems like frustratingly like inconsistent with a lot of the experiences expressed by members of the panel and members of the audience, whatever, that like, let's see how to say it, like to say that there's no difference between like, being in cyberspace, whatever, and the real world, and that like these technologies can, I guess maybe, I'm trying to think, it's ranged across a whole lot of things in the last few minutes, but what I'm trying to get at is the fact that like it seems obvious from what people are expressing that what these technologies are, these media, like mediate and determine in particular ways that like are like sort of like really alienating, like I think it contributes to like a sort of like making imaginary of like our relations and politics. And let's see, I'm not sure, like, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to like wrap it together with like the question. So like Marx and the idea of like human creativity was introduced, and another, but like aspect of like Marx's theory is the fact that like via commodity exchange, like our relations to other humans like becomes commodity exchange. Like we relate via commodities, and our relation to our own human creativity gets less like mediated through commodities. And so in a similar way, like what kinds of like relations we're like capable of, like what we become as subjects, seems to be like heavily mediated at this point by what Facebook is and like how Facebook is organized by its the people who write its algorithms and stuff. And it just seems to I don't know, ignore so many of these things to say that like if we could just have like free time, like these things wouldn't matter. We wouldn't be like alienated, like miserable people maybe, like if we're still relating to each other through these things, or that like alterity plus technology, that like alterity isn't being mediated in a really, really, I think, like alienating and oppressive way, through these technologies. I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly where the question is, but like it just seems like incoherent, these like positive positions in relation to the, like actual experiences being described.
Sorry, no, I don't know. I don't think so. I think because the idea of culture jamming and commandeering these images is nothing new. The Situationists had that whole idea of, and you're talking with Invisible Seattle, it's the same idea of taking these images and the way in which capitalism manages your social relations and jamming it and creating different images that show you something different. And just by showing people different ways of relating to each other geographically, because it didn't come from the capitalists, it helped inspire actual protests. And at the same time, you're going to need levels of protest. Everything that I'm talking about sounds abstract, but you're going to need to create a political theory. You will need electoral practices. You will need people, take white people and put them in the Trump side, like make them infiltrate the right and jam it. Make the other, think about these imaginatory, liberatory possibilities. Because without the disruption, you just have disruption, but you don't have the imaginary. You don't have liberation at the end.
Because resistance.
Right, but nobody's saying images are just images. Tools are just tools. They're not. They don't have any moralistic value to them intrinsically. They're just used by us. Maybe that is a value. But no one's saying that you can't get online and make memes yourself and influence people, and it does influence culture.
I think speaking to misinformation and disinformation, a great way to deal with trolls online, which, we claim, I think there have been some 4chan on the alt-right, and great way to disrupt trolling online is actually become a troll. In fact, you're always your best troll. Yeah, I mean, you're the best troll of yourself, really. And infiltrating troll groups is really easy because they're addicted to trolling you. They're addicted to trolling things. I think that's all I really wanted to say about that.
Trolls.
Part of my interest in thinking about all this stuff is organizing, I guess. I've been trying to think about the ways in which we could organize around post-capitalism. And it's kind of hard, I think, for a lot of people to imagine what that would look like, because we think about organizing always giving us immediate results. And we have this frustration that we want to let go of. And I think on some level that we have to accept that that we may not see the results we want in this lifetime, and that we have to think long term. And I think for some people that just increases your frustration and distance from wanting to be involved in some kind of project that would maybe liberate future humans. But at the same time, I'm not completely, against the local move, in the sense that I think that if we are to be changing the world, we have to do it on our own terms, and think that, that not only the activist class is going to be the ones that are changing the world, and that we have to take it into our own sectors. It's the person from Tech Solidarity here that was talking about that last night. It's a great example of, taking it into your life and thinking not as politics as something that you do on the outside of your daily life, but it's a lifestyle. And that we create the conditional responses of the people that are in our life, and that we take on educational practice to try in our own places to create, micro change, and that we hope will elicit the long-term effect. And then maybe if we're thinking of a more large-scale change that we could assemble, we could, do what the neoliberalists did and assemble 400 think tanks across the world, like a machine, having red maze in every single city,
I like that idea. I don't think there's any single recipe for how to
Exactly.
overthrow capitalism.
Yeah.
It's not written there in a book, and there's not a little house, a palace that says capitalism on the outside, and you think, oh, let's just go take that one over. As Nick has said, it took 200 years for the long transition from feudalism to capitalism, and without wanting to make people depressed and think, oh my God, it'll take that amount again. I think you're going to, if I could borrow a famous term, talk about combined and uneven struggle, which is to say, figure out a way or a point where you want to struggle, and let all parts of the left figure out how we can create a synergy between the various struggles, rather than have one type of struggle lecture to the other type of struggle and saying, you're not following the recipe. It says here that you're supposed to do this. We're really exploring. Right.
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Could I ask, in relation to that, something that I guess I was trying to get at when I said this might not be new, but also think about it in relation to the question of development. Is the other primarily an urban capitalist resident in this alternate, given the contemporary ongoing existence of primitive accumulation in many parts of the world, not as a past, right, that we have gone from feudalism to capitalism, but the increasing recognition of the extent to which the relocation, if you will, of capital into China, into India, as the project of development is a project of displacement. So what is the relation between the upper and the subaltern?
And the what? I'm sorry.
The subaltern. The
Subaltern.
Oh,
yeah.
what is that? The
Oh, okay.
I can maybe try and answer. I think, I mean, in a certain way, the Western subject is so ingrained within capitalism that it's just extremely hard to imagine a sort of alternative. And I think actually, most hopeful stuff does come from developing economies. I think the sort of labor struggles going on in China, labor struggles going on in India, South Africa, other places, are far more interesting on sort of class consciousness level, so the awareness of their position, but then also the sort of tactical innovations I think are quite interesting too. And the potential too, since capitalism hasn't consolidated to such a degree as it has in the Western world. And I think in a certain way, like myself, white male Westerner, I'm quite trapped in my position. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think, yeah.
If I could maybe try to rephrase the question. How Eurocentric do you think your reliance on technology to solve the problem? How Eurocentric do you think that is?
I mean, my response is maybe you can respond to that, but there's a research article that came out from Stephen Logan, 2015, on basically technology and positionality, and so the cross-cultural analysis basically says that, and this is, I'm guessing, mostly in developed countries, but basically once technology/social media is introduced, dissatisfaction of one's position increases. And whether or not we want to call this class consciousness, the literature wasn't trying to find anything out about class consciousness, but maybe this is the closest we could find out that if Mark Zuckerberg is, to quote, connect the world, that may be some kind of starting place for connecting the uneven struggles across the world.
Not to like plug the next thing, but honestly, if you want to know more, I feel like about the positive construction of the subject, I would stick around for the next part. Only because I don't want to do a disservice to things, and there are people on the next panel who are talking about the same things that we're talking about, but some are from countries that are not seeing this automation taking jobs and stuff yet, but they're still imagining this idea of liberation and otherness in their own way and how they can reinterpret that for those countries.
We actually need to take a break pretty soon because we're starting the next panel at 3:15.
Just going back a minute ago to what you're saying about imagining the future of business, and that's actually, as a psychologist, like a good description of exactly what I've been researching for like 10 years. So I have a model of epiphany, I have a model of the subject, and I have a model of how to deliver that to technology.
They know I have to throw it away because they don't want to do it. You waste 11 lines. You waste
I think when she brought up the law term, she was referencing to an essay by Gayatri Bach on the
Okay. I really wish that it was more structured. I mean, at least the dimension a bit more structured. Like I was thinking, I would have preferred to have gone through each person and have them say how their projects that they work on, like I'm curious, how do you see that in relation to technologies and I feel like that would have been a better starting place. But just due to like very little time.
Hot take. You're mad.
like
Okay.
liar.
Yeah, if you post it, I'll.
They're preparing for the next.
No, not to pay for that. So this is like one when we die in 20
That's what it's all about.
and pass away petrol drugs in the and it got picked up, and it's especially been picked up in black because it is it's for refugee and so it's an alternate history if you alternate trajectory for our
have entirely corresponding. So,
other histories of
Like this conversation, the conversation.
and also other relations to the online. That's only the replacement of the videos. So I was quite interested in the making the stories of selfies, probably more which change, which makes an international marketing process. Like if you compare it in my business, or in my case, I want kind of it's actually quite too much. And you see but now this is time to become there, yeah. So there's very interesting ways in which earlier histories were to migrate here to leave. I am actually transformed. And again, it's all the long term yes, except that otherwise very much a commodity celebration. Yeah, circulation. In my mind, I don't like it. I mean, I think there's much better work coming out of India. And I think that he's also he focuses on commodities or other types of and so and then there's other types of technologies which are about online, which are really so there's this big movie called Red Light. It is, to my mind, a new genre of documentary, which is sort of post-realism. Or if you want to think of, for documentary sort of private self-realism, in the post-realism documentary, which accounts for the fact that the documentarists and the people who document are modern subjects, educated subjects. We do not access that which they seek to document, which in this case,
It's funny because it's been like a year.
but at the same time, Franklin everything. Not as culture, how you understand culture. And they exclude video tools for journalists to find in the forest. Right? So they're this is how you find out. So they are also very much managing their image, managing their messages, but it's a necessarily
sort of lyrical trajectory.
But it's not like I'm not
Are they headed towards something interesting?
But yeah, so I guess it's like, you know, I can see for how like I want to talk about how they imagine. So they're trying to do it through the alphabet. And there's someone maybe not really, but someone who's probably in one of those areas who's with some of these other squares is that they just come up with this
I don't know if it works, but because it is.
Because I think like if you can tell all of these different narratives or ideas that you do in history, you can find some background. Or I think that if all of these things through the network of the internet, like I think with Capitalism, they were able to we can create a simultaneous different
one point was you're saying self or I or whatever.
You can really tap into post-subaltern work, which is really not. I mean, that's been going on. I go to Delhi and Calcutta all the time. They're the guys I hang out with. I mean, I don't really. No, Sarai is much more. It's also great. It's very much more contemporary. And these guys are about thinking. So the combination of economists. So there's a Lacanian in there. There's a Marxist. Actually, one of them was Steve Scullenberg's student at Riverside and practical ethics. So it's this really interesting mix of and many of them Asian, so there's also this very interesting role of medical doctors in this, because there's a way in which a lot of folks turn from science, because they went to doctors to do science as a form of treatment. And the body they were the now. I mean, Basole, he did it simultaneously in neuroscience and in Marxism at yeah, and so he's now part of the people's science movement. So he's so there's this entire new sort of that who are looking at also contact points where a new creative accumulation happens.
It makes perfect sense that that's what. Just last week, another way in which I think they do around but voice what I'm trying to get at is that's why
compiling
extended
information.
algorithmic
That's the area
networks
that
where there's a lack of
maybe push something.
able to project themselves. Or
Lack of.
if you want to call that yourself, that's the thing. Ego may have nothing to do with it. It's just a managerial voice, managerial practices of having some distance from that, trying to construct a sense of safety so as a time participant that has this distance to this managerial voice that will run it as a code and do whatever it's doing as a kind of like managerial summary of I think it's sort of listening to that. It need not be king. You can't just be.
But, yeah. I do know.
So it's all about how our reality is constructed through hypnotic linguistic so that's how those networks communicate. They are programmed as what they are. We are programmed to be psychopathology is when symptoms do not have a social context that protects them. It's the same behavior. What I was going to say is so yeah, I think what we could try and put in happening is be one view like this entire psychology it's been reflected as a source of throughout history. For the first time, that's like the Illuminati myths, like the handling and the ability to speak about myth and great myth in general into our speech. So back in time, stuff like the media, and then through that, it's using that in civil society. And so this persecution of the older level class that once existed, like 4,000, 5,000 where you have the first, the the strongest and medical resources of all intellectuality for the first time in human history were persecuted by the hedge persecuted and destroyed the global science. That's what that's in the for the first time. So we have to be able to speak about these higher registers, which actually subspace.
You should. Are you familiar with someone named John Trudell? There's a jot this down. John Trudell. There's a version. If you go on to YouTube, you can find DNA. I forget what it's. I forget what it stands for. John Trudell was an American Indian movement activist and poet. DNA is a lecture that he did in the 90s. And it's on YouTube, but make sure you look at the long one, because there's one that has about 8 minutes missing and it's really long show. But it's and there are other sources for this, but it's a narrative. It's a really full narrative about. He's basically going into European history to discuss the subjectivity of Columbus and Jewish people, and when they encounter human beings in America, basically their understanding of the sacred as it came evolved under Catholicism in the 18th century, really rendered them into a place where they had no concept of what a human being was. Through serfdom, through desacralization, so that they just weren't equipped to encounter human beings that they met as human beings, but really as and they also their interpretation goes like little qualities of them being soldiers. Hey, I'm rich. Sorry. Yeah, oh, yeah. I really appreciated your contribution. So we'll be living in Seattle. How long are you around?
Just like a couple of days. I'm leaving Monday. Tomorrow. Yeah, so I came out on Thursday. But yeah, I'm just here for the talk for the so.
Yeah, no, I'm really appreciative of what you said.
Yeah.
Are you now? Oh, cool, cool.
Yeah, it used to go to many announcements that after the site, it's just
Oh, cool.
but I did like a lot of projects and
Dynamite. Yeah, Anders?
Yeah.
Anders.
Yes. Oh, no worries.
With the literal focus of the site, everything is like, or not,
Yeah, I should grab some.
so you can't simply say, we have this person that's a really different professor, very different subject, and then you don't understand it. But you have to simultaneously acknowledge the lack of what we call
Yeah, it's like some subjects, like from getting and
That's amazing. That sounds like a very successful. Yeah. I always forget when you're on these spaces that I like how those people that I don't know, yeah. That's what it is, yeah. That's talking about healing people like that's what I get. It's cool. Just the intro, it's like just like that's like the class and like what.
Yeah, no, that looks really good.
Yeah, I'll send you from them.
Oh, Jesus, I have written what songs have we done? How much we have?
I'm like more worried right now about like I don't know everything else. I have like cancer thing coming up in June, and then I'm gonna witness something. If it turns out okay, I can't do that anybody. I can't like everything's fucking like I'm dead. Not dead. It's like just gonna get better.
Like,
It's supposed to be really quick, so I haven't, if I'm not dead yet, so I'm gonna extend like the range a little bit. I think I'm gonna cover that. So I get in front.
Who is this? Have you met them?
Yeah, it's over. The one who got really high.
Oh my gosh. They're such clever.
Yeah, and Nick is like
Is that the
idiot.
person you all want to fuck really badly?
Yeah, Nick is an idiot IRL.
I know. It's like,
but he actually like, I mean, he did earn that. He did earn that with my own. Like, almost like, well, it's weird to get him right. Like really well.
yeah, I was like, what the fuck? This is a really well text messages.
Yeah, no, that's why I like I get random vignettes of like, yeah, I'm so we talk about the business cycle and we're like, guys for dreams. Are you gonna do that today?
No.
Sure.
We could all go to people right?
No.
Just reading something for 600.
I don't want to get I would have some good somewhere though.
Yeah. It's too crowded.
Yeah, it's too bad.
I like Seattle.
Yeah.
Just keep going. Just get to see what's happening.
We're just too stressed around here for this. Yeah. Anyway, and we just get away, you guys.
Okay. My defense, I was like, oh, what's your finance?
No, I always just see how the base is, right?
Well, I read comments.
So that, yeah, it's, I
You
don't
read
want to do
one? Yeah.
Plus, already it's like you could stay with my mom first and I realize it.
Thank you.
Every day and scrub that couch.
I woke up every day and ran. And hid in the car for hours.
It really went to like hide in the car for an hour.
It was 2 hours.
It wasn't 500.
No, 2 hours. No, it was an hour and 3 minutes. Hey, it's not a big deal, dude. None of that was our fault. Like, we were literally us.
I was like, okay, I forgot how to stop my family.
I was like, this kid, y'all. It just like looks like
this is actually how much I think things are in Uganda. They're like that stressful. This is probably like less stressful than you are.
I was like looking for us, rush forward. I was like, it's okay. We're not all gonna get sick. I was literally thinking about this before you came out. I was just gonna hit the streets. She's so scary.
She's so nuts.
She literally banned me from the premises without ever seeing me.
She's not so funny. I'm so glad I can't get rid of her.
It's just sensitive.
Nice. I almost kind of like an afternoon or something rather than yeah.
Oh, okay. We can go to darkness and house. And
it's only about 2 hours, 50 minutes, right?
really nothing.
And then we can go and put into Williams. Yeah. Williams to Montana. Unless you want to stop anywhere in Montana or Idaho.
Idaho's gorgeous.
Wyoming.
Yeah.
All of these states are gorgeous. Yeah, I like
that. Really was fast and I don't want to get killed, so.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's talking about.
Well,
Yeah, I really wanted to have for a day. Yeah.
Alice and I went south and that was good terrifying comment.
What's that? I was passing.
I know, I realized like halfway through that like, wait, I like look to the toilet. What if I'm supposed to do pee on fire? This is so fucking basic. I just don't realize it's gonna never leave my apartment.
Yeah, that's what's really stressful about like I didn't integrate after a while. I didn't have any on, and I was like, oh crap! People are looking at me really weirdly.
Yeah, like over here, like I don't know, not St. Louis. You know, like I was like, wait, where's? No, it's not Indianapolis.
It's an amazing essay.
Cross Indianapolis, and then like
realization.
Go to Louisville, like actually cross Kentucky, because like Kentucky's okay. Which has more Illinois, right? Illinois gets even more. Like, but you know, it's okay. I know people in Kentucky, they're okay. And then
Kentucky is hilarious essay, you should write it.
South
I realized the South exists.
I think it was
South exists.
It was upon entering in Nashville, where like, we're stopping the gas outside Nashville. It's like, wait, Alice, they're guarding. Oh my god, look at all that side of it. What's going on? Like, you wanted me to laser part? Look at what's down. Look at it. State your intentions. Hell. I don't know. Yeah.
That's the part of being American actually. Even Illinois is not good. Go outside of Chicago.
Yeah, well, yeah.
You're actually fucked to go outside of Illinois.
Like, Springfield's okay. Actually, I'm pretty comfortable in Illinois. That's the living center. So, like, there's like, generally Springfield, like blue counties, and then if you can go south, like St. Louis, like everywhere else.
Yeah, I'm like that. I just realized that my friend went to Cuba Mile on Saturday. And they were made full of it. All of it was equal for people performing in the mall. That's so cool. It's a nice little thing. So cool, and you can hang out after, and they have rooftops on the floor. Every member okay with
I know what's going on. I like, that would be tight. I like some, they have a cool tea shop there.
They do, and they screen movies pre-release.
Yeah.
So, like, the place I really want to.
Oh my god. Yeah, it's just like, when you get the paid membership, right?
You do, but it's not for performing there, right? Then some photographers wants to like shoot you.
Yeah.
They're like professionals working in Mali, and it's a really good program.
Well, we need like a number of Tuesday.
Pardon? cancel that and just hang out in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Just make this trip really well in America. Like really get Malaysian food right next door to South's house. Also, it's my friend.
When was the last time you were there? Also, why is there such a classic fucking flowers there?
Because it's safe.
Oh yeah. What's St. Paul?
Yeah, because
Oh, it's like that close together. What's fancy this for all
no, Minneapolis, I was there in last time.
Oh yeah, the Quad Cities. I already noticed because of, what do you call it? Space Jam. Quad City DJs. Davenport, Moline, and I forgot what the other words. Gelsmer? I don't know. They're like West Illinois, around Iowa. Cedar Rapids. Just like, you know, the greatest parts of the
Yeah.
I need to get out of the Midwest at some point.
Chicago's nice and everything around this world.
Yeah.
I Grand Rapids.
From Chicago, nice.
Me neither. I like Grand Rapids. I like Seattle too.
I should move to Nova Scotia. There we go. Prince Edward Island. What is that? St. Brown. It's over here. Dartmouth.
I like Baltimore.
No.
Just hear really amazing music scene there.
Yeah, Baltimore's pretty neat. I could from Philly though, over Baltimore.
Philly is transfer center.
I didn't know that. Okay, I'm not. Let me revise that.
Should ask Collins just to go back here.
It's like mimetically known for. Mexico City comes up.
Actually,
I
I
really want
thought
it.
it's expensive, but
It's tight. It's super tight.
that's for that with no money. It's
Yeah.
the best place to actually Mexico City because you can live off a day on $10 easily and like get really amazing food.
Yeah.
Get really strong.
I heard that as well. I'm also finding that they have like casino pizza.
Yeah, and
Yeah, they have like.
so yeah, you
It's like
do
Cochran.
you do hostels or like stay for
It's like Cochran, yeah.
It's supposed to be when you can get most.
It's pretty like I
might do that.
can't leave the States.
Really?
Not after I applied for asylum for like half a year. Stay around.
Actually, I think Neo.
Yeah, that's about it.
It's really cheap.
Yeah.
I'm like really angry at Mom. I'm good next. I am actually pretty
Yeah. I gotta stop looking scholarships.
Oh, fuck, you're right.
Hello. I'm so hungry. Please give me one. I don't want to spend my fortune on tuition. Fuck you. Because the thing is, like, like I'm relatively rich right now, but like when you go to college and spend it on college, like it's gonna go within like a week after the payments processed.
How many semesters can you pay for yourself?
One.
Such a bad
Barely
idea.
one.
Oh my god.
Not even one. I have like 22 grand.
But aren't you like that's not enough to like that's still under poverty line.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be forced to pay that.
Yeah.
But the moment you get the decision, you should be able to get all of it paid off.
Yeah. I just like the thing is
All is like citizenship.
oh, citizenship's out of the question. I just need to either apply for asylum or
It's not asylum, you get like in state or like in country?
Yeah, I get in state. Yeah, and I would get access to like stuff. I just need to speak to a lawyer in Chicago when I get back. Lawyer.
I can recommend you.
This is the same one.
The guy who got two illegal alien parents as citizens of the United States. Yes.
I met only one of your parents.
My dad had a green card and is applying for it. It's very sad. I was very hoping that they just get the tourists.
I'm gonna say 2K green. Yeah. I don't know how to do it through now. I do it through
I leave bar as
The issue that I need minimum cash.
insofar
I
as
don't have that anymore.
I'm trying not to do the Bernie Sanders where I'm like,
you're not
Yeah.
having the same conversation. That's how. That's why.
So we're wagging.
I agree with that. I mean, that's why.
Oh, we got quite a collective here. Is Mohammed here? Is Mohammed?
The protocols.
Hey everybody, we'll start soon. Thanks for coming, and sorry it took a little while.
Yeah. Exactly. I just have to Yeah, it was the concept of
all the types of things.
which is statement on the concept of the Tao. Yeah, separate problems and use it, and everything takes account of all of your content. You can say, yeah, you can say like, I wish I had deleted this post, but everyone can have their app configured to hide that because they're polite. And they would like, they'll allow you to forget things that you want to take back. That's up to them. They want to not do it.
Yeah, it's really
Because it's all on the blockchain, it's all on the blockchain. You can't invalidate blockchain without everyone else is possessed about the property. And that's the reality, whereas we work in unreality systems of like the music industry talking about them like they're real objects. It's all based on a total falsity and what it is actually.
Like years of just remote college.
How would you use those on the
Get in touch with their marketing. It's totally fascinating on social engineering. Wow. Yeah.
See, that's the type of racism. Yeah.
Is there anyone who could help us do a mic check so we can just make sure that the audio is working? Someone in the Hangout, could you unmute? And
1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Mohammed. Can you try again?
1 2 3 1 2 3.
Hello.
Hello. There we go.
We here.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna ask them to turn it up just a little bit. Could somebody say something just to test it once more?
Hello?
Hello. Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Maybe just a little more, yeah, because there's a couple that are a little quieter. Okay.
Do you want any notification or anything when we're getting close? Because we have a show in 5.
It's 5. Okay. Okay.
We can do a quick transition.
Okay. Okay.
Like 4:45.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind. 4:45. Okay. Hello. It's not working now. Hello.
Adventure time. If you walk through and suddenly all we have is ads and like
Because how are they going to hear us then? How are they going to hear us unless we are amplified?
That's a good question.
I'm going to go see this.
And all these unmuted microphones.
Yeah, it was really good. It's an adventure-related series of films on the same subject. And you're trying to put depth into the subject that you want them to be in. So you have to work back to see all the rooms that would have to lead them from where they are to.
Yeah, that's why it's you always have to look at the psychology that's really in it. Because, like, I don't think if you know this kind of person work through psychotic solution the other night. And basically, I get on her level. And, like, basically, she's talking about code, which is basically narrative, not narrative. But she's like, oh, I need to fix the code, global computer.
Just so that you're.
Oh, okay.
There's not going to be a mic.
Sure, sure.
So you're going to have to talk like
Really loud?
4 or 5 times as loud as you might be comfortable.
Okay.
In order for them to hear it.
I can yell.
Okay. Cool.
Hi, Kareem and everybody. Can they hear me?
Yeah.
It's like a weird dissonance. Like I'm looking at
And then bring what you're familiar with.
Yeah, Kareem said yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Maybe can I hear Petra and everybody at the end?
Test.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a bit of a slight bit of a technical issue, which is that we can't have the microphone that we had last time because we have the Hangout going because we're bringing people in from the Alt Woke Collective, which is known as Anon. Actually, this one is just Neha, Alexandra, and then the people in the Hangout. So if you two,
Wait, can we have them too?
you can.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. Well, it's just how we set up the panels, but yeah, it's fine. So everybody here is going to have to basically speak like 5 times louder, otherwise they won't be able to hear you, and so then there won't be able to be a conversation. So cool. Okay, so all right, so we'll just go ahead and begin. We have a number of members of the Alt Woke Collective known as Anon. If you want to look it up, you can just Google Alt Woke, ALTWOKE, and it's online. And the collective has written a number of other things as well. The main member of the Alt Woke Collective who is here with us today is Alexandra Mason. And then the other people on the panel are basically dialogue participants with Alexandra, and also with the people in the Hangout. And maybe we could have the everybody else on the panel has been introduced already. So maybe the people who are in the Hangout could. Well, that's right. It's anonymous, so right. So they probably don't want to.
I mean, it's up to them if they want to introduce themselves abstractly, maybe.
Okay. So if people on in the Hangout coming from mostly I think New York City and Berlin, if you want to introduce yourselves one by one, you don't have to name your name, but maybe just some kind of like a abstract introduction if you'd like to do that. You could maybe start with Mohammed. Mohammed? Oh.
Oh, okay, maybe not.
Maybe not Mohammed then. Would somebody else like to go first and introduce yourself?
I'll be the one introducing myself. So if anyone else, I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in. I'm Kareem. I guess that's about it. That's all I said. But
Anybody else?
Yeah, sure.
Or do you want to just remain anonymous? Go ahead.
yeah, sure. I'm a math student, and I'm actually from Central America, and so my interest in the Alt Woke is informed by those experiences. I'm probably going to be talking about that later on.
Okay. Great. Perlenta or Ro, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm a sound artist, and multimedia artist, and I'm based in North Carolina. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay.
I'm an art student, and I'm based in Detroit.
Great. Okay. Well, then let's move over to Alexandra, and if you want to just maybe like summarize the idea of the Alt Woke Manifesto and sort of what Anon is trying to do, how it intervenes into this question of capitalism, technology, and subjectivity, and then we can just kind of open the dialogue from there.
Well, I think it's just a continuation of some of the things that we were discussing in the first panel. Anon is both and the project of Alt Woke is talking about the idea of wokeness in popular culture and saying since wokeness is the predominant way in which the left seems to express itself, here at least it is a tongue-in-cheek reference to that, but at the same time a serious critique of that form of politics. And at the same time, while critiquing it, it's trying to present a alternative. Vaguely. Sorry.
The what expresses itself? That Alt Woke is out there something expressing itself.
Yeah, the left. Yeah. Sorry.
And what is the significance of woke in that? And why alt woke?
Sure. I think, well, maybe Kareem can talk more about this. It was just saying a critique of the ways that or the tactics that we saw being used, and some of them were like congratulatory attitudes towards Jaden Smith becoming a face of a fashion campaign, which obviously is just the tactic of corporations trying to commandeer your ideology and identity to sell it back to you and sell you a product. And the fact that we saw people, for instance, heralding that as a good thing and cheering for that as a good thing was for instance, one of the critiques that we had of this idea of wokeness, because people on the internet seem to be saying like, oh, I'm woke, but they were actually putting forth these ideas and tactics that we just didn't agree with.
I would say the critique of wokeness is largely pretty much woke. We're using wokeness as a shorthand for like the left at large, both across the spectrum from moderate centrist liberals to the most extreme radical. And the basis of the critique is there's a shortage of strategy. We don't feel like the left at large is prepared in a sense to take on like the complex challenges of like the post-industrial world. Let me kill my camera. Sorry. Yeah, yeah. And you see this like iteration of wokeness in like various ways, like poptimistic, like using like My Calvin, like that My Calvin's ad, or where you pretty much like you're reappropriating like the identity of like these marginalized people, and just making it a product. It's it's incorporating the other and enmeshing it within superstructure to then feed base. And that there should be an alternative to the left, because I guess like to understand what alt woke is, you would have to like understand what the alt right is. And I don't know, we feel like the alt right is like the future of right wing politics. If you can make the argument, an acceleration argument, that capitalism itself and the way capitalism flows is like this, cybernetic, like almost AI structure, you can make the same argument that like culture and language functions in the same way, and that we're like now with the ubiquity of technology and like the fact that everybody is like plugged in, like it's it's like this network of constructed hegemony. The camera issues.
Does anyone else in the Hangout want to chime in about that? If you think that the alt-right is the future of the right, then what should the left be doing to create the future of the left that it's not doing already right now?
Cohesion would be one tactic. Like the alt-right isn't just like one, it's not a monolith, but it's like it's a network of like different schools of thought that predate like the christening of the alt-right. It's each like component or each like constituent within like the network of the alt-right, it all needs each other. Like you have on like, I guess on the upper tiers, you have like the intellectual heft, like white nationalism, which, you know, the media characterizes as just rebranded neo-Nazism, or sorry, this rebranded genteel white supremacy that David Duke was trying to like, you know, make you know, policy within the 90s. But like the reality is like white nationalists in the context of the alt-right, they're paleo-conservatives who are like honest. They're honest about their ethno-nationalist like bent and aspirations. Something like NRX, which is like a, you know, short for the neo-reactionary movement. It's pretty much like it's you know, throughout the I guess this entire conference we've been discussing like this new mercantilism, this new like feudalism that you're seeing emerging with these like platforms. Like NRX is like the it's like an ideology. It's like the ideology of this new like anti-free market libertarianism, this monopolistic libertarianism that's like that, you know, that permeates like Silicon Valley. You have human biodiversity, which is like racialist. It pretty much is just racialist pseudoscience, just rehashed findings from the, you know, from the Pioneer Fund, you know, scientific racism. And then you have like vulgar libertarianism, which you know, encompasses like anarcho-capitalism and just very extreme forms of like, you know, just extreme forms of like economies that like want to just fully liberate like rapacious capitalism. Like, but again, so that's like one end, that's like one tier. On the other end, on the bottom end, you'll have something like you have the Tea Party, which is like a mutation within the GOP, which is like a result of the war on terror, the 24-hour news cycle, the culture of fear that begat, that the innate xenophobia that you know, is that you could make the argument was always like embedded in the culture. But they, you know, if you examine their media and you examine the connections, they all utilize, or like no one, they don't throw each other under the bus. They don't critique each other. They, even if they disagree, and like, you know, there are like, you know, a lot of disagreements because you know, again, it's not a monolith, but they all need each other to function. And the left isn't like, you know, the left isn't really doing that. The left, you know, it's like broken, fragmented. It gets into micro arguments about micro arguments, and it, you know, to combat these like new emerging like catastrophes, it's, you know, it's going to take like a cohesive political force, both on a populist and on a legislative end. And it's, you know, since it's like, you know, it's since I guess like Fukuyama's like thesis that like history's ended, that there's no, you know, that there's no active, like, you know, active force like to combat the dominance of like neoliberal capital. It's, I don't know, the left has been in this like defensive position, and where, you know, it's like we're just applying band-aids to like, you know, gaping wounds at like at this point. But cohesion would be the first step. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, could I add on that?
Sure.
So I think, Kareem, you were talking about platforms and infrastructure that I think the alt-right has steadily built up over time. And when we're looking at things like 4chan, and then you're looking at Peter Thiel's investment in seasteading and all these kinds of alternative modes of organization. And I think the fact that Silicon Valley in our culture has been able to steadily present a form of what the future would look like, and that they seem to have a monopoly on what this future would look like, has allowed our culture to equate modernity with capitalism. And so I think part of strategy needs to be how can we articulate a vision of the future that's worth believing in and would draw people into disavowing, I think, the monopoly that Silicon Valley has on what the future looks like.
Okay. Infrastructure building, that would be the obvious next step. There's an I don't know, the left has like an aversion to like utilizing the tools that are already there. Like there's this odd nostalgia for, you know, this Bolshevik revolt that's, you know, doesn't look likely, doesn't even seem plausible, you know, in America at least, or in America where you have like a middle class, or like, you know, the gulf, even though the gulf is widening between like the gulf in class is widening, but like you know, there's still this like myth. Sorry, there's a little nervous, but like there's like to preface, there was like a document that we wanted to get done before this talk, and it would be a point by point, you know, summary of like what alt woke stands for. And I guess what we'll be discussing in this particular panel is like 3 arguments from that larger document, which is, one, you have this myth, this crystallized myth and essentialism that's a part of the Western narrative, and you don't get the alt-right without this narrative. 2, the ubiquity of technology and how that's morphing politics, morphing the subject, morphing dialogue, and kind of it's, you know, integrating the virtual with like the real, to where like, you know, virtual phenomenon is now affecting like real world things, and consensus is hard to establish. And I guess the third would be the relationship between a concept like Afro-pessimism and the concept of accelerationism, how the intermingling of those 2 topics could, you know, bring about what we feel is like a singularity that can only be attained through the other in like all its different iterations. We think like the most explicit form of the other is, you know, blackness, which is, and when we say blackness, we're not talking about like anything genetic or like biological, but more so like an ontology of like what blackness is. And blackness is like, you know, the erasure of an essentialist mythology. The, I guess, intellectual origins of Afro-pessimism comes from like Fanon, and Fanon's statement of, you know, blackness existing between infinity and nothingness. And in this like Promethean space, he has to, the black other has to construct their identity, construct who they are. And that, you know, both the discovery of like the indigenous and the African other led to the creation of white identity, because it's so, the indigenous and like the African is so different from Europe, different from the hegemony of like of Europe's history, and the relationship between this black other and indigenous other, and, you know, mercantilism and its development alongside capitalism. You know, mercantilism morphing into capitalism, the markets being born around this, like in the age of discovery, and the fact that emancipation, that like the catalyst for the emancipation of like the black other was technology, and that there is this like relationship between the other and technology. And the first instance of this is like the distortion of language. You know, like the other, of course, inherits like the hegemony of of course, of the dominant power structure, and it's through language was able to like distort it, both language and music was able to like overcome what like poverty and right-wing politics kind of like gutting the civil rights movement, and just completely destroying the Black Panther movement, and there being no real political force for like the Black underclass, but like through like the Black other constructing their identity musically by first distorting language through creolization and like slang, and through music and media technologies and the ubiquity of media technologies, and was able to shift hegemony in a way that like that legislative practices could not combat, that poverty itself could not combat. It's pop music now. I mean, you can use music as like, again, as this thermometer to see where society is, where culture, where we are, what society's ready for, and what's, I guess, going on in the sphere of culture. But like music, it's like black to say that there's Black culture as this distinct thing is like no longer accurate, because Black culture for the most part is culture. It's global. Sorry, I'm like rambling at this point, but
And I also wanted to add maybe a bit of a definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about technology. And I think for most of us, although somebody can push back on me if they think it's any different, I just see technology as tools, as a tool. Like if you're in a certain country and you fashion a slingshot to throw it at the person oppressing you, you've made a technology, I think. So it's not just the technology that we're all talking about. I think it's this wider idea of utilizing the tools that you have to lead to your liberation, whatever that struggle looks like. Oh, sure.
There seems to be this idea that using the tools of the capitalists,
sure,
that it's like there's something that we shouldn't do. And that goes back to the nostalgia Kareem was talking about, of like this Bolshevik revolution happening.
Right.
And that could happen, but that that implies complete economic collapse and all these things that we should try to avoid, right? Until then. So I think there's what you're saying about technology is like a mutual, morally neutral thing. I think that's correct. I think it's like obviously correct, but like it's made unobvious because of the capitalists are very, very good at making things that people love, like Twitter and Facebook. I mean, Twitter was started by countercultural elements. There's countercultural people.
Yeah.
And these are things, Facebook, I mean, people love Facebook. I mean, I'm addicted to Facebook. Lots of us are. And people just come back to it. We can create things that people love and just keep using.
Right,
and I think that's part of where we're failing, is that the capitalists, they make these great things. And they become benign.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think a lot about 4chan culture in general, not only because it's where the alt-right kind of hung out, it's because I remember that at a certain point in time, a lot of people that were doing seemingly liberatory things by making these spaces were like teenagers. Like Moot was like 14 and he made this site. And at first, I think that it was mainly lefties on there.
I wanted to add on that. I'm sorry. Yeah, like 4chan's origins, like I remember when I used to browse when I was a teenager, it wasn't always a right-centered, political, engaging image board. There was a lot of left topics. A lot of hackers that used to visit 4chan weren't totally into right politics. I don't know when along the line it divulged into being totally an alt-right like closet for things to proliferate proliferate to where they are now. But 4chan for me, it wasn't when I first started using 4chan and started visiting 4chan, it wasn't alt-right echo chamber. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it left. It's because well, I don't know for sure because it's not a study, but in the people that I've talked to that I know personally that have been on 4chan, they all left around the same time. And I left when, so people remember there was one idea of anonymous and you had these rules and everybody was cohesive and together. And I left right when it started to fracture, because then you started to get the anonymous like in 4chan, but then you started getting the anonymous is legion. And the idea with anonymous is legion anon was like, oh, we can start playing with political things, because it happened after Project Chantology, which was when they decided to troll Scientologists and like harass them, essentially. I forgot why. I think they just didn't like something that they did. And then they started meeting up in real space. And I think at that moment I was like, all right, I'm out, because I feel like it became too, the overlap became too weird and real. And I think it lost its chaotic, maybe not neutral, chaotic evil, but on the left, and then made into, tried to be lawful.
It became serious business.
Yeah, it became serious business. Lawful evil. Sure. Oh, there's some.
I'm kind of curious, Sandra. So do you think that, like, when spaces, I guess, have more friction, so to speak, like bump up against the real world and become that serious business, do you think that that is what, in part, radicalizes them and pushes them right?
Maybe say a little bit more, or go off of that.
Well, I used to be on 4chan and a lot of other like forums that were pretty fucked up.
Yeah.
And, like, you know, we were just fucking around, and at the time I did not have any ability to like really extend my understanding of my actions.
I understand.
And then the thing that I kept seeing was every single time it was all for the lulz and fun and games, it became increasingly more radicalized. And my hypothesis was that the practices in those spaces themselves and like the sort of frictionless space that they represented was the thing that radicalized those people. But that was just like my perception of it.
Well, my perception was that it switched over specifically when it tried to get more political, or when you start, not just when you get trolling, but when you got people trying to troll with these political identities. But if you think of politics as, well, the difference between, say, like, philosophy or political theory, in my opinion, is one of, like, the difference, or politics in general, is one of action and one of talking about the public space and public sphere. So if we were to define it in that way, then maybe there's something to what you're saying. I never really thought of it in that way.
Okay. You choose. Okay. I want to draw out this dialectic that I see in the Alt-Woke Manifesto and how it's received by people. So the original critique, and I didn't know about this event, but Jaden Smith becoming like the spokesperson for a fashion line, and then people lauding that, and then people critiquing that is all very interesting, because it could become hypocritical, because what that whole fashion event represents is the fashion industry trying to brainwash people with, you know, a public figure, basically program them to buy more clothes or something. And so they're trying to put out a certain narrative and have people take up that narrative.
Yeah.
The Alt-Woke Manifesto is trying to do that too, but it's doing it explicitly. It's letting people in on the joke.
Right.
And there's a lot of humor, and there's a little bit of messiness in its own self-presentation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I've seen in the way that people receive this is it kind of comes down to, like, or you could say that the Alt-Woke Manifesto is a really good barometer of, like, whether someone's, like, deep down an ally or not, or, like, whether they have a sense of fun or something like that. So because a lot of people, majority of people I've talked with, they like it, and they might say, like, oh, it's a little messy or something, but yeah, it's good stuff. And then a minority of people I've talked with, they don't like the Alt-Woke Manifesto. They have a reaction to it they think that it's sloppy, bad theory, or they think that it's just like stupid or something like that. And the and it's interesting because and you guys were kind of alluding to this a few minutes ago, all being kind of a synonym for subaltern, and there's another word in there, and then those words kind of being synonym for black. So like Alt-Woke Manifesto kind of Alt-Woke Manifesto kind of inviting people into other, being able to share the other subject, going on the joke, and how that is like real wokeness as opposed to just the identity politics of calling myself woke and using that as an identity token. And so it's this really kind of interesting complex dialectic where we're trying to put out a narrative which brings people to being in on the joke of being able to put out narratives. And so, yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, because what we're trying to say is not, I think we tried really hard not to moralize things when we were making these arguments. It's more prescriptive, I think what we're trying to say. It's just like, expanding upon the stuff that I was trying to say earlier, and that we're in this enhanced type of reality, is that to combat that, you can't combat it necessarily, I don't think. I think you have to just accept, at least for now, that that's what we're living in. And with that said, it's like, I don't hate facts, I love facts, but I think that the old fact economy is dead. So if you want to give people facts, you're going to have to package it in this way that is within a competing alternate reality.
It's very interesting. All that is conveyed to me by the type of writing that's in the Alt-Woke Manifesto, but it's very hard to explicitly come out and like articulate what is conveyed in that type of text.
Yeah. I hope I don't get like someone's list or something. You know?
Well, to speak to that, the style and everything, if you want a clear, concise definition of like what alt-woke is, we actually don't want to provide it because that's kind of like not the point, really. Again, this like, you call it like A-B linear way of like processing information or delineating information it's an old, very Western way of seeing of seeing the world. It's like we make the argument that this linearity, this like ontology of linearity, you see it in like classical philosophy, like Aristotle, and that there's like there's a symmetry between like Aristotle's like empiricism and like Abrahamic religion, and that it's like essentialist. It kind of like puts the human first, the human as like the ultimate subject. Aristotle categorizing and categorizing like life forms, like mineral, plant, animal, whatever. It's like similar to like how like Adam's steward in the Bible, like Adam's steward was to categorize and name everything. So like it starts from a framework where like human, and of course the first human is a male, and this like male is made in the image of God, and then woman, the woman comes after, and it's like it's born out of this like out of this man, out of this, and it's again it's like you had this essentialism that was like already crystallized like into. We're starting off from like a bad framework to begin with. It's like we call this hypostition, where it's like it's a myth that a hyperstition is like a myth that like is above the framework of society, and it makes itself real. A hypostition is a hyperstition that cools and like it solidifies and it becomes hegemony. It becomes narrative, and it's like from, I guess, beginning of classical, starting with that framework of like Aristotle and Aristotle's essentialism, Aristotle's teleology of like this arate, this perfection that's like in forms, and like like through linear progression, like this excellence will be reached or whatever. You see like a parallel with that in Christianity specifically, out of all the Abrahamic religions, like where like in Judaism and to a certain extent in Islam, God always speaks through an intermediary. In Christianity, God, who is like, it's like excellence epitomized, it's like anthropomorphized, like it speaks through human, it speaks through like, and of course a man, it speaks through like a human being. It speaks through man, son of man, Christ, or whatever. And Christianity is like different too. It's like Christianity breaks away from this like Abrahamic tradition of aniconism, and like aniconism is like it's like this aversion to like creating images or whatever to represent creation or God. But like Christianity breaking away from this tradition, like it's it helps to develop European art, which like in European art, again it both diagnoses where society, what's going on in society, but it is like a vector for like ideas and concepts, and that track, but that framework, that like that linearity developing over time, in the white European subject, there's like this promise, and it's we make the argument that it's that there's a relationship between labor and this like this promise that you too can reach perfection, you too can reach God through your work in the afterlife, but that more explicitly with like the Protestant Reformation, or like the Protestant Reformation, and you get the absence of the clergy, like sorry, I'm all over the place, sorry, I'm over caffeinated, but you get the absence of the clergy as like this dominant pedagogue, and you start to see a shift happening between like Northern Europe and Southern Europe, where like in Southern Europe there's like, because we're situated within the Mediterranean, it's very trade heavy, or in Northern Europe also, like with Southern Europe, it's highly Catholic, and Catholicism, it's like it's crystallized in Southern Europe because of its geography. Northern Europe, you have Protestantism, which, even though aesthetically Catholicism is more pagan, Northern Europe in its practice, or Protestantism in Northern Europe in its practice, is like it's like this pagan return to nature, and again that empiricist framework is in there. So like you get the development of science first, and like most effectively in Northern Europe. It's like these schools are there, but like the Enlightenment begins, like it does begin in like Northern Europe. Galileo's burned, but like you see, sorry, but you see the split where like, oh sorry, someone else wants to speak.
Hi, Boo. Yeah, we got Matt.
Yeah, sorry, I'm rattling.
So, since we're talking about the other and blackness,
right?
Would have a concept of the practices oriented around blackness and otherness that sort of are, and this feeds into another question. I don't want to the issue, but it's something I've noticed in Black culture historically in the diaspora, is that we're very effective in syncretism. Syncretic. We're able to take and transform, and it's not exclusive to us, but we do have there's some notion of like toxicity that comes into that. Like if you look at patriarchal culture and blackness, and that can be very toxic.
Right.
How does Altlook kind of handle that conceptually, and what do you think the practices are around just blackness in such a way that and otherness, the blackness and otherness, that you can identify toxicity or even emphasize what is non-toxic? I mean, that's a really good question. I think that's in a sense why we include, in the sense of otherness, almost all others. And I think in part, I can't necessarily say, in my opinion, like what the reality of that would look like in actuality, but I think it's allowing this imagination to be placed in the hands of those people and those identities. And if you sort of look at the way, like I was saying earlier, I think that some of the internet culture, and at least meme usage, is inherently sort of democratized. If you can allow almost all others to create their own imaginaries,
the ones that I believe will become most popular will be the ones that are the will of the people in of itself. So it'll be almost like a runoff almost, or a melding together, because the internet also allows for pastiche and like remixing. So there's nothing to say that you can't take the imaginary that say a trans other or something thinks of and meld it with the black other or the other, you know.
That's interesting, because I think what happens in online culture a lot of the time is as soon as you see a syncretism, as soon as you see a blending or a pastiche, you have an entirely different, and maybe this would be more of the woke collective who come and claim something as their own. You can't do that because that's actually ours.
Right.
And so it's kind of there's kind of a fence there where you do have people who identify as others and are attempting to engage. I think at least I wouldn't say blackness specifically that we're the only people guilty of this, but we do tend to have a certain generational quality. My grandmother would have never complained if she had heard somebody, if someone had posted a video of a black child and interest and interest in sharing that with their community. She probably wouldn't have had a problem.
Yeah.
And this is somebody who was just a couple generations, maybe a generation removed from slavery, but we today tend to have a lot of issue around that.
Yeah.
Using even dreadlocks as an example, we've had a lot of back and forth in terms of our communities around this stuff. How do we actually include other people in that? I mean, where's the actual guardrail?
Yeah, I think it was what we're trying to do, and in one of the critiques we have of the left, and some of the left, the younger internet culture left, right now is it's so, it harps so much on literal phenotype, and it uses that as a measuring stick with which it can gauge inequality and who is being wronged by whom and all this stuff. And we think that that alone is not what we're talking about. When we talk about the concepts of whiteness, we're not necessarily talking about white people, individuals. It just so happens that that like permeates those people a lot. But we're talking about an overarching like system, like a historical narrative. Yeah. What would you say? A typology?
A technology. Whiteness as a technology, it like created in respects or like in relation to like blackness as a technology or like otherness as a technology. And that was created again like during like the Enlightenment period. Yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off. I apologize.
Oh, please. That was great. I mean, I think yeah. So if you talk about, I think these issues on a certain level of abstraction, it allows for a little bit more cohesion amongst people. Because even then, like, white individuals can be obviously a part of this, whatever. We also kind of want to end that concept of whiteness only because of the relation it has to other things. Like, I don't know, we always say, like, talk about how you're German or Irish or whatever, but the concept of whiteness is simply one of colonization and domination and all these other attributes that we don't necessarily think anybody in the left wants to be attached to, irregardless of actual literal body and phenotype.
So how do I guess going back to what Kareem was talking about, Kareem had mentioned like sort of like the Aristotelian like humanism, right? And I'm just sort of like thinking about the fact that like the left as it exists, specifically the moderate left, centrist left, it co-opts humanism a lot, and it appropriates humanism. How do we, I guess, sort of being, not even sort of, like, as casted as racialized being rather than human, produce a future, like produce future from there, in conversation or like against that.
I'm sorry, can you ask that question again?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh my gosh, no. Oh, I'm so bad.
Alexandra, I mean, I could probably comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah, so something I was thinking about, someone mentioned syncretism earlier, and this idea of like blending different cultures and so on, and how that informs practice. And so I was thinking of this the work done by Black quantum futurism that kind of draws out connections between, for example, Western science like quantum mechanics and so on, and how it relates to sort of an Afrocentric understanding of time, and how you can use those two things together to articulate a post-colonial futurism. And I think that in itself is important for at least me thinking of like these places in like Central America or the Caribbean or wherever, where there isn't so much of a similar economic landscape as urbanized post-industrial countries, where you would like to have something like a post-colonial ecologically informed aesthetics that would be able to connect lines between people in post-industrial countries as well as those developing countries. And in doing so, by it being ecologically informed, I think that in itself already is a direction towards undermining the sort of Aristotelian humanism, because then you start thinking about other intersections between, for example, the forms of neocolonialism of like large companies coming in to these places and disrupting local ecosystems and so on. And so there's so many, I think, interconnections just by looking at like Afrocentric cosmologies, indigenous cosmologies, and ancestral mythologies and so on.
Building off a couple of these threads.
Sure. You might have to like project. I want everybody here.
Okay, so building off a couple of these threads, I want to pose the question: are you all for the abolition of race? Is that part of the equation? And also, what do you think about the concept of transraciality? And I'd like to have that conversation in reference to what you all are raising, and not Rachel DeViso. That's a yeah.
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday. It's always really hard to bring it up. It's like your language has to be precise.
Yeah.
You know. But yeah, no, go for it.
And just to follow up, maybe to make it a little more precise.
Sure.
My friend Shaman Salam and I have been having this conversation over the years. Is race a cybernetic technology? And you were talking about whiteness as a technology earlier. And I'm thinking about, like in terms of how that goes, how that's still ongoing. Like, has there been thinking about like workers who have been coded as white have often been historically in high capital intensive industries.
Right.
And whiteness is so associated with efficiency, I think partly because of that, and you're talking about the Protestant work ethic and all that, right? So, and then sort of blackness being coded as inefficient, and this sort of this exterior, this other that needs to be subsumed and destroyed, and so I'm wondering, is like basically are white people, or sorry, is whiteness cybernetic? Is whiteness already sort of a cybernetic technology that is sort of within our bodies as an assemblage or something, and can it be hacked out of or deconstructed or disabled? Can something else be created, and would that be like what's like the potential agency of blackness presented in sort of this open-ended sort of contingent universalism that you're presenting, like this otherness that could shape and transform other cultures it comes into contact with? What role would sort of blackness have in possibly disabling this white cybernetics?
Wow, that's a really cool question. Hopefully everybody else can jump in, but I do want to say, like, at least my
framework for the other is one of dichotomous creation through the face of each other. Obviously, like I always go for Fanon's idea of othering, in that like the construction of whiteness or white people is in relation to blackness, obviously, and they play off of each other. So I do think, like, ultimately, if we're talking about the deconstruction of or transformation, I want to say, or transcendence of this identity, that something would probably, or the deconstruction of that identity would probably have to happen on the other side as well, like simultaneously. Or just like deconstruction of one of the identities, I think would cause a reaction in the other to react in a certain way. So it just depends on how that new identity is formulated. I think, like, ultimately, I don't know. Yeah. Anybody have any?
Yeah. I'll keep it short because I've been rambling, but whiteness is a cybernetic technology in the sense that it's pulling from constructed the constructed narrative of like what the West is. But we'll make the argument that it's a self-limiting technology. We'd even make the argument that whiteness is kind of rebelling against itself. It's because of its relationship with capital, and this myth that you can achieve excellence. I think like that myth is like, it's becoming the expectation of that myth is like it's kind of dwindling. I think that people are kind of losing that idea that if through my work, through my labor, I can like join the upper echelons of society, and it's because of like changes in like both like sexual mores, gender mores, that there's like the typical totems of success in like patriarchal Western culture, that they're no longer accessible. Like women, you say it could start with women to be even women entering the workplace, women like having the ability to, I guess, women having the ability to like direct their own like determination, through suffrage, and then going beyond that to like a cis biological male, like completely abdicating this like identity of like Western white maleness, and like saying that I'm no gender at all, or I'm both genders, or I'm the other gender. Sorry. That there's this like disillusionment with like whiteness as like as an ontology that's like permeating below the framework of society. It's my little short answer, a little also rambly.
Yeah, I wanted to address part of your question. Like, is whiteness cybernetic? Can it be disrupted? I think I'm not sure about whiteness. I'm not saying yes or no. When it comes to gender, I think people ask me from time to time, why are so many trans femmes technology workers, like programmers? And I think I would like to say all gender non-conforming people are programmers. When they don't conform to gender, they are doing programming. It's
right.
It's close. It's like computer programming, but resembles it more than maybe a revolution.
Right.
And that is, I suppose, in one way, that's how we already contain the other. That's how, like, the alien is within each of us, and it can be kind of like programmed into presence. It can be not necessarily upgraded to maybe like hijacked or something like that. Like, it can be. I think, yeah. I think when it, maybe that's the best I can. Maybe that's.
I just want to contribute to our friend who asked about the post-colonial other and putting the post-colonial other into discussion. And I just wanted to suggest that maybe one way to do it is to actually think of the other as itself a space where there is a possibility of conversations across the different types of folks, so that we don't try and constitute it purely as an abstract position, whiteness, but more as an emotionalist set of practices. And in that spirit, I would like to suggest that maybe it's worth looking for theories not about, but from other places. And I'd like to suggest in particular 3 places, and there's more, but there's 3 places to my knowledge where the idea of a post-colonial economy is at the center of what's happening. Some of the Marxists in Brazil who are taking that up in a different way. Another is a bunch of Turkish Marxists. Some are unfortunately not able to get back to Turkey right now, but influenced very much by their rereadings of the Quran as a way to actually rethink not just what does capitalism look like, but what would communism look like if communism is about a different interaction with the other in a different way, then what would that look like? How would you think it? How would you practice it? What would it mean? And this has been at the center of their question. And then a group that I am much more familiar with because where I am, a group of scholars coming out of India in 2 particular locations, which have one is around the sort of science movement, and the other is around what is called Adivasi politics, which is around politics. And it addresses, in India, the question that the people are trying to address is, if over here the theory is coming from people who see capital as it leaves, right, deindustrialization, what does history and experience look like for those of us who see capital as it comes, right? Because that's where it's arriving. And that, so it's 2 sides of the same process, but actually experienced very differently by different others. And sort of centering that makes them actually fragment the idea that there is a single history of capital. I'm putting that up. So I do want to just suggest that intellectual sources could be as diverse in imaginary features as the diversity of sources.
Does anyone up there have anything to that, or should I take another question?
I just need to do a time check.
Okay.
They have a.
Could they actually come closer and repeat the question, because we're having problems hearing it?
Didn't hear any of that.
Oh man.
Exactly, and it sounds like there was a lot of value there to chew on and to turn around.
Because there's no microphone, so they couldn't quite hear it. Yeah, but I just want to say this probably should be the last question because they're showing a movie at 5 and.
Then someone else should come, because it wasn't a question, it was some references which I can give just by email, so that's fine.
Oh, okay.
I like to, just before you leave, could you just give us some examples of the type of activism you participate in? I mean, we've been talking about why you're doing things. I'd like to just talk a little bit about what you're doing, because some of us aren't like in the web. So
who's not in the?
Well,
I don't even have a Facebook account.
Everyone.
Well, I guess the answer to that, and we can't speak for obvious reasons. We can't speak too much on it, but there's a corporate aspect to what we're doing. That's in its seed phase, and if platforms, if corporate personhood can move politics within this country, and like platforms, we're seeing a new type of corporation through these platforms, the left does itself a disservice by like not, by not joining that, by not getting in on that, by not being part of that development. Sorry.
No, I just think that there's not enough spaces, perhaps. The way the alt-right congregates on the internet, it's just like not the same the way the left congregates on the internet. And I think that we need to push into create more spaces on the internet that engage the same way that the right seems to have seized. I'm sorry. I'm nervous. I'm gonna stop. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, I've met a few people that tell me that their political identities are basically formed by memes online, and I think part of the way that the Outlook Manifesto phrased itself in terms of like this hashtag is itself a way of like pushing it forward in a viral way, and I think that's an important aspect of what they're doing.
I don't know if that even is very
Oh, I
concrete.
think it's very fun.
Okay, cool.
I think, I'm not sure if this is necessarily activism. It might be like proto-activism. It might be the way in which I'm preparing myself to be an activist. Right now I'm a frightened coward and don't like to be in public or leave my house. But I think one way that I can like prepare myself to do so is as the primary vector of the way in which I'm oppressed is kind of transport. And what I'm trying to accomplish, it's not necessarily a public activism, but what I'm trying to accomplish is to become like gender proof. In a way, like less than not even non-binary in a way. And I think one way to do that is to actually like acknowledge that the way I've been alienated was the labor of my freedom's construction. It quotes as, feminist rights. The ways in which I've been excluded are actually, in a way, if you could find a way to put them into. So it's more like not quite activism, but I don't know.
So you guys are clearly like, what's going on here is an emerging ideology, right? You're taking, you're sublating it in this, and you're sublating from past ideologies, and you're trying to like form your own identity. And if you're taking criticisms from people who are saying you're all over the map, well, the map. And you will solidify, and then I think that's what's going on here. Probably wrong.
Yeah. I just remembered right now, actually, to your point about connecting people in other areas. Actually made a sort of splash in Peru, and it kept on a lot with them, even though they don't, for I think historical reasons, don't want to use the word communism or don't like the word that it's in there. The fact that I think it caught on in there and they are trying to articulate it in its own way is, I think, really interesting. And they're using it because, like, for instance, there was one person there that says he's actually aligns himself as neo-reactionary. At the same time, he's gay and has his identity. So he didn't like the
fundamentalism.
Yeah, the fundamentalism and traditionalism within NRX, but he had no other alternative to imagine his own identity, like to align these two things together. And so they're using alt woke, and they made like some groups and stuff. I think I would rather make a ideology, although it's always interesting or always important to remember how you make the ideology. But I'd rather just try and create the ideology, make the infrastructure here the way I know how to, and allow other people in those other areas, like however I can get it to them, and let them sort of create their own imaginations with it.
What do you
mean?
You're imagining to do it. I'm
Well-
not imagining they.
I mean, they do as well by taking it and spinning it however which way they want. It's not like there's a set ways in which that you have to make. Yeah, because it plays off of each other. The ideas that we've had in that group, because we're in that group with the people who have taken it and say all these other things, we share some of the things that they've said about it on our meme page or whatever. We although it's hard because of the translation, we still share like all these things. We have used some of their contributions that they've had ideologically to it in further future works that we tried to create. So it is like a whatever conversation.
Even the name Supremacimo Meltdown.
Yeah, it's not
that was their suggestion.
Yeah.
Half-blood supremacy. This idea of like a Metzicism as an ontology, as a universalism. It's a kind of active intersectionality. That was their contribution. Their idea of like it's a Deleuzian concept. I forget the name, but something with conjunction. But like where we were able to like expand upon the ideas of like left accelerationism because of their contribution that like left accelerationism should aspire to be, in a sense, aspire to be like NRX in terms of like its practices, not its ideology, divorce the fundamentalism, but the Prometheanism of it, the industrial aspects of it. So it's, we're in dialogue, we're constant dialogue with these people, and it's like, if there's one takeaway, like Alt-Woke kind of speaks to the way we see the world, which is like embryonic. It's just, it's to completely abandon that like linear, like Aristotelian, humanist, essentialist, like a way of seeing things. And there is no final answer. There is no end of history. It's constantly developing. So that's.
Yeah. Is alt-woke just another slogan? And if not, why not?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I take the idea to be sort of, because it's actually the term itself was created or talked about online a really long time ago. Maybe not a really long time ago, months ago by this one artist, Daniel Keller. And he was saying like we should make a really irritating name for like a alternative left and like make it purposefully kind of like silly sounding and stupid sounding. So I guess like thinking about that is kind of branding in a way. It's thinking like a corporation, or it's thinking like advertisement.
It's not so much another slogan. Like if the name becomes polarizing, we would just abandon the name and have other members less, the more anonymous members, they would be the spokespeople, and we would reemerge as something else entirely. It's not so much branding and like sloganeering so much as it's kind of taking a piece away from the accelerationist argument that neoliberalism is bad, but what can you learn from neoliberalism? Why was neoliberalism able to be this like dominant force that it is? Like, is there a power to like branding and all of this as like a vector for new ways of thinking? And I guess like you can make the argument that like, and you can see a parallel with like the neo-reactionary movement, where it's like what's interesting about neo-reactionaries is you don't even have to, it doesn't need to be a movement. It could be two people. You don't even have to ascribe to the ideas, explicitly ascribe to the ideas of neo-reactionary to be a neo-reactionary. You can accidentally be neo-reactionary. Like this Gulf futurism that you're seeing, this like in the Middle East, like in Dubai, or China, like this emerging emerging like industrialization, infrastructure building that you're seeing in China is like, it's a perfect example of this. Like, it's really, it's just bait. The name is bait. It's a meme onto itself, but like the core tenets are like, we could go through a million names, but like the core tenets would remain the same. Like this is how we feel like the future of left-wing politics should go. Because that's the way that the right-wing politics are, that's the way it's moving. So.
Yeah, we should wrap up, I guess, right?
Yeah. Sorry for being rambly.
Thanks, everyone.
Later.
Thank you.
Yeah, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
See everybody else. Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah.